Hey guys, tonight we're heading way back, like pre-pillow, pre-language, pre-deodorant kind of back. We're diving into what married sex might have actually felt like if you were a woman tens of thousands of years ago, during the Paleolithic era. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. Between childbirth, infections, mammoth stampedes, and your partner maybe mistaking dominance for romance, you're gonna need a thick mammoth hide blanket and a deep breath. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and what time it is where you are right now. Are you just dozing off, or still sneakily scrolling under the covers? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're cold. That's your first impression of Paleolithic marriage. Cold and a little hungry. You've been gathering roots all day, your feet are raw, and your partner, let's call him Grog, is still out somewhere trying to spear a wild boar before nightfall. You live in a cramped cave with your kin group, and privacy isn't a thing. If you're lucky, there's a designated rock corner for intimate time, but honestly, you're more likely to just sneak off behind a tree, quietly, because predators. Now, marriage, as you know it, hasn't been invented yet. But you and Grog have a long-term thing going. You've been sharing food, fire, and fleas for a couple seasons. In evolutionary terms, this makes you a pair-bonded hominin. The anthropology crowd thinks early humans didn't just hook up randomly. They formed cooperative duos, maybe to raise offspring, maybe for stability, maybe just because it's hard to get berries alone when you're 8 months pregnant. Sex? It's not quite candlelit and choreographed. You don't know what romance is, but you understand touch, scent, and body warmth. And while male dominance is a factor, bigger muscles, louder voice, better access to the fresh mammoth meat, it doesn't mean you're powerless. Some research suggests Paleolithic women weren't just passive mates. You likely had a voice in who you chose, and if Grog turned out to be more me smash than me respect, you could probably peace out and try your luck elsewhere in the clan. This wasn't a world of marriage licenses and church vows. It was flexible, practical, and deeply rooted in survival. The actual act itself? Again, no beds, no doors, no Spotify playlists, just a cold surface, maybe some animal hides, and an understanding that it's time to try for a baby or reinforce a bond. Fertility wasn't just personal, it was tribal. A new baby meant continuity, more hands for gathering, and eventually more spears on the hunt. That put your womb somewhere between sacred vessel and community investment. Here's where things get a little weird, in a beautifully human kind of way. Among some indigenous hunter-gatherer tribes, our closest living windows into Paleolithic behaviour, women weren't always monogamous. Some groups practiced what anthropologists call partible paternity, the belief that multiple men could father the same baby. So a woman might sleep with more than one man intentionally, hoping to gather father energy from each. The result? Less paternity drama, more collective child rearing, and probably a less possessive attitude toward female sexuality. So while you and Grog might have a bond, there's no ironclad rule saying you can't, say, cozy up to Brock from the next cave over if Grog keeps falling asleep before dark. In some groups, the concept of ownership just didn't apply. That doesn't mean things were paradise, far from it. Violence against women certainly existed. Power dynamics shaped everything. But it wasn't always a one-way street of oppression. You had strategies, alliances, aunties, and sharp rocks if it came to that. The fringe fact here: some ancient cave art might not just be about bison and heroic hunts. Hidden among handprints and spirals are symbols some scholars interpret as early representations of female genitalia. The so-called vulva stones aren't exactly erotic novels, but they hint that Paleolithic people were aware of, and maybe even revered, the female body, at least occasionally. Were they the first pornographers, or spiritual artists channeling fertility magic? No one agrees. The debate rages on, and no one wants to be that archaeologist who yells, "This is a vagina," during a conference. And that leads us to our scholarly head-scratcher. Was Paleolithic sex empowering for women, or not? The evidence is murky, often speculative. On one hand, there's anatomical equality. Women had endurance, strength, and essential skills. On the other, the harsh conditions and physical toll of childbirth suggest your body wasn't always your own. It's hard to feel sexy when you're foraging in lice-infested hides while dodging saber-toothed cats. Still, there's a strange kind of freedom here. No rigid church doctrines, no corsets, no centuries of layered shame. Just instinct, survival, and the occasional cuddle under the stars. If Grog remembers to kill the fire, you fall asleep to the sound of wolves howling outside, Grog's heavy arm draped over your chest. You don't think in words like foreplay or liberation, but you know what you like, what you'll tolerate, and when it's time to slap a hand away. That's something, isn't it? You wake up with a crick in your neck, a smear of ash on your cheek, and a vague memory of Grog snoring halfway through what was supposed to be a moment of intimacy. The Paleolithic world doesn't offer much in the way of romantic closure, so you shift your bones, brush some beetles off your leg, and start prepping for another day of surviving. But tonight, we're time-travelling forward, out of the caves and into the world's first written civilization, ancient Mesopotamia. Welcome to Sumer, where rivers flood unpredictably, the gods are temperamental, and married sex now comes with paperwork. You're now the wife of a respectable man in the city-state of Your name is etched into a clay tablet, barely. Maybe it's there as a footnote to your husband's business dealings, or as part of a fertility prayer. Either way, your identity is now officially attached to a contract. That's right. Marriage is no longer just a mutual agreement sealed by a shared meal and a handful of mammoth fat. It's a formal, legally binding arrangement with conditions, clauses, and expectations, including the sexual kind. The ancient Mesopotamians weren't shy about defining bedroom roles. Your marriage contract might include specific language about producing children, obeying your husband, or even providing him with a surrogate concubine if you fail to conceive. Romantic, right? And yes, that arrangement also meant your husband's access to your body was more or less guaranteed, as a form of duty, of stability, and as part of your end of the bargain. Now here's the historical fact. The oldest recorded marriage contracts, etched into clay in Sumer and Akkad, outline not just economic arrangements, but expectations around fidelity, especially for women. A woman caught cheating could be punished severely, even drowned in a river. A man, well, he was likely just warned not to embarrass the family. But it gets even more complicated. There was this fascinating legal loophole, the hierarchy of wives and concubines. If your husband took another woman into the home, either as a second wife or a slave concubine, she didn't always have equal status. You, as the primary wife, might still run the household and outrank her. In theory, this gave you some power. In reality, it made for a tense domestic situation where emotional safety was scarce and jealousy was built into the walls. Still, don't assume you had zero agency. Some women in Mesopotamia owned property, ran businesses, and wielded religious influence. As a priestess or temple attendant, you might actually escape marriage entirely. In some cases, temple priestesses, known as 𝕳𝖎𝖘𝖙𝖔𝖗𝖞, were even exempt from childbearing, which may have been a radical form of autonomy in a society where your body was often treated like a baby factory with legs. But here's where things get truly strange and kind of amazing. In certain fertility cults, ritual sex was seen as sacred, like you, yes you, might be selected to participate in a ceremonial act of 𝕭𝖑𝖊𝖊𝖕, or sacred marriage, where a high priest symbolically mates with a goddess, usually represented by a high-ranking woman. These weren't quickie ceremonies. We're talking incense, music, chanting, wine, and full-on performance. You're part priestess, part surrogate deity, part political symbol. And maybe in the right context you feel powerful, respected, adorned, untouchable by the laws that bind the other wives. Or maybe it's still exploitation with better lighting. That's the ongoing scholarly debate. Was sacred sex empowering, or just patriarchal theatrics wrapped in divine branding? Meanwhile, your average Mesopotamian wife isn't attending orgiastic ceremonies. She's managing the household, raising kids, grinding grain, and performing her expected duties, sexual included, under a system that treats her more like a reproductive unit than an individual with desire. There's no term yet for consent as we think of it today, but that doesn't mean emotions are missing. Love poems exist. Some of them, scrawled in cuneiform, even speak of longing, touch, and pleasure. Not just procreation. One particularly spicy tablet from around 2000 BCE has a goddess whispering, "My precious sweet, let your love be honey upon my lips." See? Not everything was sterile and duty-bound. Passion existed, even if it had to wear the mask of religion or allegory to be acknowledged. But let's not idealize it. Your body is not yours alone. You're expected to be fertile, loyal, and silent about your needs. If you refuse your husband's advances, there's no court you can appeal to. If you suffer pain, fear, or trauma, that's simply not a category people know how to name yet. In some ways, it's worse than in the caves, because now it's codified, written, stamped by kings and scribes. And the fringe fact: some Mesopotamian love charms involved actual magical recipes to influence desire. One found in a tablet included crushed dates, incense, and, wait for it, bits of your lover's toenail clippings. Brew that into a potion and whisper his name under a full moon. Who knew romantic manipulation was so crunchy? Scholars still debate whether Mesopotamian women had moments of joy in these arrangements. Some evidence suggests private moments of intimacy, small acts of defiance, or encoded forms of expression, like weaving secret symbols into textiles or singing songs that only the other women would understand. It's the constant push-pull of agency within confinement, power within patriarchy, and meaning within monotony. By the time you've finished lighting the oil lamps and washing out the linen cloths, Grog 2.0, now called 𝕭𝖏𝖊𝖊𝖕, is home from the ziggurat. He smells like barley beer and bureaucracy. He nods at you, unrolls his sleeping mat and gestures. You move to him, not because you're overcome with desire, but because you know what's expected. And somewhere deep in your body, buried under duty and exhaustion, you remember those words carved by some anonymous poet. My love is a well of fresh water. Pour it on me in the desert. Maybe tomorrow will be different. You're lounging on a low couch now, in a white linen shift that clings to your skin in the thick heat. The year is somewhere around 1400 BCE, and you're in Egypt. Upper class this time, thank the gods. Your name is carved into ivory hair combs and scratched into pottery shards. Your husband is a scribe or a merchant, maybe even a minor priest. You live in a home with actual doors. You have perfume. And believe it or not, sex in marriage is starting to resemble something you might almost recognise. You're still expected to be loyal, fertile and composed. But in Egypt, women had a little more leeway than you might assume. You can own property, you can inherit land, and yes, you can initiate divorce if things go sour, though let's not pretend that makes the bedroom a totally safe place. There's no word for wife in ancient Egyptian that means subordinate. The common term 𝕭𝖏𝖃 simply means female partner. Sounds promising, right? But let's not get carried away. For all the equality on papyrus, your married sex life is still tangled in religious duty, fertility expectations and societal judgment. Still, the vibe is different here. There's an air of pleasure around marriage. Erotic poetry was not only written, but celebrated. You're not just a womb with feet. You're a lover, a muse, a partner. Scrolls describe kisses as sips of beer, and lovers as my lotus, my sister, my heart. The sister bit is poetic. Don't panic. It's a term of endearment, not a genealogy mishap. And in practice, well, your nights with your husband might include fragrant oils, music, wine, and, get this, actual foreplay. The ancient Egyptians believed in pleasure, and not just for the man. Medical papyri discuss erotic stimulation, fertility positions, and even mention the clitoris, suggesting that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. You probably have a fertility amulet tucked under your pillow, a clay frog or hippo figurine dedicated to 𝕬𝖎𝖏𝑚, the goddess of childbirth. She's part hippo, part lioness, and entirely terrifying in a protective mom way. You pray to her not just to get pregnant, but to survive the experience. Because childbirth, still life-threatening, still brutal. But here, at least, it's accompanied by ritual, magic spells, and midwives who actually know what they're doing. And here's your historical fact. Ancient Egyptian marriage was often informal. No official ceremony, just a mutual agreement to cohabitate. But sex outside marriage, still frowned upon, especially for women. Fidelity was expected, though not always practiced. If you're caught in an affair, you risk social ruin. Or worse, a magical curse etched onto a broken figurine and buried in the sand with your name on it. A lot of problems here were solved with spells and symbolic vengeance. Now for the quirky part. Egyptians believed in post-mortem sex lives. 𝕬𝖏𝖃 depicts couples holding hands, embracing, even making love in the afterlife. You and your husband might be buried together with statues of yourselves in intimate poses as if to say, till death, and then forever after. Romantic? Maybe. Or just more pressure. The open scholarly debate here is whether women truly had sexual agency in marriage, or whether the evidence is too idealized. Erotic poems and tender tomb inscriptions might reflect real affection, or simply aspirational fantasies. Were you truly cherished, or were you just idealized as the perfect, fertile, obedient wife? And then there's the temple system. You've heard rumors, maybe even whispered prayers, about the women called 𝕭𝖊𝖏, who serve as musicians and dancers in temples, occasionally crossing over into sacred sexuality. Some believe they engaged in ritual sex as part of religious devotion. Others argue this was all metaphor, not literal action. The lines between performance, prayer, and intimacy blur in this sun-drenched world of incense and illusion. At home, though, your marriage is a quieter arrangement. You bathe together, sometimes in a clay tub. You grind barley while your husband reads scrolls. At night, you slip beneath woven linens and he reaches for you. Not always gently, not always kindly, but with a certain familiarity. You know his rhythms, his moods. You've learned when to lean into desire and when to pretend sleep. And here's something most history books won't tell you. There were contraceptive recipes. Actual ancient Egyptian attempts at birth control. One included crocodile dung and fermented dough, inserted vaginally. Another called for acacia leaves. Effective? Probably not. But the effort is there, a tangible reminder that women have always tried to control their fertility, even in the most pungent ways. You sometimes wonder what would happen if you refused him. Just once. Would he strike you? Would he sleep with the maid? Would the gods smite your womb out of spite? The fear is there, unspoken but constant. You're not property, not exactly. But your options are narrow, and your survival is tied to this man who shares your bed and your bread. Still, there are moments, quiet, precious ones, where the moonlight touches your skin, and your husband presses his forehead to yours, and it almost feels like choice, like connection, like something ancient, sacred, and maybe even kind. Those are the nights you remember. As dawn bleeds over the Nile and you light a stick of blue lotus incense, you whisper a silent prayer to Hathor, goddess of love and joy. Not for fertility, not for protection, just for a moment of warmth. A moment that's yours. You've left the gentle lotus-scented breeze of ancient Egypt behind, and now you're trudging through the dry hills of Canaan, or maybe shepherding goats in the highlands around Jerusalem, sometime between 1000 and 500 BCE. You're married, again. But now your sex life comes with not just societal rules, but actual divine commandments. This is the world of ancient Hebrew law, where your bedroom is no longer just a personal space, it's also a legal and spiritual battleground. You're a Jewish wife in a tribal world, part of a covenant people. Your marriage isn't just between you and your husband, it's a microcosm of the nation's relationship with God. Sex isn't sinful in itself here, surprisingly. In fact, within marriage, it's expected, even celebrated in certain texts. But it's also highly regulated, woven tightly into purity laws, patriarchal customs, and a serious emphasis on reproduction. And for you, as the wife, that means duty and desire must coexist whether they get along or not. Let's get the historical fact out of the way first. The Torah lays out very specific rules about sex in marriage. There's an entire section of rabbinic tradition, ketubah law, that ensures a husband provides his wife with food, clothing, and conjugal rights. That's right. You're actually entitled to sex, not just subjected to it. If your husband refuses you, he can be held accountable, spiritually and legally. That sounds promising, doesn't it? But before you stretch out and celebrate, let's zoom in on what conjugal rights really meant in this context. This wasn't about your pleasure per se, it was about ensuring reproduction and maintaining a stable household. Sex was a husband's duty to you only insofar as it fulfilled your role as mother, wife, and moral foundation of the family. And once you've given birth to a couple of healthy sons, don't expect much more than routine contact, if that. The actual logistics of sex in this world are tied to purity cycles. After menstruation, you're considered ritually impure for 7 days. During that time, no touching. Not even a casual brush of the hand. Some couples keep separate beds during these days. Then, after a ritual bath, mikveh, you're clean again, and marital sex is allowed. There's something strangely ritualistic about it. structured, predictable, maybe even comforting, but also mechanical. Your body isn't private. It's discussed in law, debated by elders, and analysed in holy texts. Even the Song of Songs, an erotic poem tucked mysteriously into the Hebrew Bible, describes intimacy in symbolic terms: pomegranates, honey, gardens, fawns. It's gorgeous and sensual, but indirect. You can almost feel desire humming underneath the verses, like a secret not quite safe to say aloud. Here's where it gets quirky. Some ancient Jewish sages believed that having sex on the Sabbath was a mitzvah, a blessed act. It's not just allowed, it's encouraged. You and your husband are expected to be physically close, maybe even emotionally attuned, on Friday nights after prayers and wine. It's supposed to be a moment of union, a small echo of Eden. And if your husband's a merchant or a travelling worker, Jewish law actually outlines how often he's supposed to return to fulfill your needs. A sailor, once every 6 months. A donkey driver, maybe every week or two. A man of leisure, daily. It's like an ancient spreadsheet of expected sex frequency. Still, let's not mistake this for egalitarian bliss. While you technically have rights, they're framed by a patriarchal lens. You can't initiate divorce. You can't inherit property unless under very specific conditions. And if you're accused of adultery, things can get dark fast. There's this trial called the Sota, where a wife suspected of cheating is made to drink bitter water in front of priests. Basically a supernatural lie detector test. If her belly swells and thigh rots, she's guilty. If nothing happens, she's innocent. Science? No. Dramatic? Deeply? This is the open scholarly debate. Were women really protected by these laws, or just managed by them? Some argue that for their time, these rules created boundaries around male power, limiting arbitrary violence, formalising sexual rights, and protecting wives from abandonment. Others argue that the system simply reframed control in more refined scriptural terms. You weren't a slave, but you weren't free either. Let's not forget that your worth is still tied to fertility. Barrenness isn't just a personal tragedy, it's a social stigma, even a sign of divine disapproval. Every month that passes without a pregnancy tightens the knot in your stomach. You hear whispers. You feel your mother-in-law's eyes on you. Your husband prays harder. You do too, though you wonder if the heavens ever really listen. And yet, intimacy happens. Not just duty-driven intercourse, but closeness. Maybe your husband holds you softly after a long fast. Maybe he kisses your hairline during the Sabbath blessings. Maybe he thanks God for your presence out loud in front of the family. These moments flicker in the dark like oil lamps, small, flickering lights of tenderness in a structure built of law and pressure. Here's a strange little fringe fact to leave you with. There's evidence some women used aphrodisiacs, fig-based salves, wine infusions, and herbal concoctions to stir desire or soothe tension. One ancient text even references women painting their eyes and scenting their thighs to charm their husband's affections. Not exactly subtle, but then again, why be subtle when the stakes are your comfort, your place, your survival? You go to bed after the candles burn low, your body cleaned, your linens fresh. You lay beside your husband, who begins the Shema, whispering the ancient words, and when he reaches for you, gently as the law requires, you close your eyes and try to remember that in this world at least you are seen. Not fully free, not fully known, but not forgotten either. You're wearing a hymation now, basically a glorified bedsheet, and the sunlight hitting your stone courtyard is hot, dry, and deeply judgmental. Welcome to ancient Greece, somewhere between 500 and 300 BCE. You're married to a man who probably spends more time at the symposium, sipping diluted wine and debating metaphysics, than he does listening to anything you say. And let's just say, your married sex life. It's a carefully choreographed performance in a play where you didn't get to audition. Greek society loves a good category. Citizens, slaves, foreigners, warriors, poets, philosophers. And then there's women, more specifically, wives. You, as a wife, are legally a part of your husband's household, but not really a citizen yourself. You can't vote, own property independently, or even leave the house too often unless it's a festival or funeral. You exist to manage the home, raise legitimate heirs, and keep your husband's lineage clean and respectable. Sex, of course, is part of the job description. Just don't expect it to come with conversation. Your wedding night was likely arranged while you were still a teenager, maybe 13 or 14, handed off from your father to your new husband, who might be twice your age or more. The ceremony wasn't some romantic candlelit affair. It was a transfer of property rights. You were part of the dowry. The bed you now share with your husband is both a literal space and a legal one, a place for producing citizens, not exploring passion. Here's your historical fact. Ancient Greek marriage contracts weren't necessarily written, but they were enforceable. The primary goal? Legitimate children. Athenian law was obsessed with inheritance and the purity of the citizen line. A child born of a legal wife inherited everything. A child born of a concubine or slave? Nothing. So sex with your husband wasn't just expected. It was required to secure your place and your future children's rights. But your husband? He's not expected to be exclusive. Far from it. In fact, most Greek men had 3 categories of sexual partner: a wife for producing heirs, a concubine for daily pleasure, and a courtesan, hetaira, for companionship, conversation, and yes, sex. That last one stings, doesn't it? The hetairai were educated, witty, often foreign, and ironically had more social freedom than you. They could appear at symposia, speak their minds, and wield real influence. You, meanwhile, aren't even supposed to be seen eating in public. This brings us to the open, scholarly debate. Did Greek wives have any sexual agency at all, or were they simply passive vessels for lineage? Some sources, plays, letters, even verses, hinted affection between spouses. But the overwhelming silence around women's inner lives in these texts suggests that your desire wasn't even worth recording. You were the background to a male life, not the co-author of one. Let's be honest. Your husband probably sees sex with you as a civic duty, not an emotional exchange. And you? You've learned to read the signs. When he's drunk, when he's moody, when he expects you to lie still and let him finish quickly before falling asleep and dreaming about Plato or wrestling matches. You're told that a good wife is quiet, modest, and sexually invisible. Your satisfaction is neither assumed nor inquired about. And yet, here comes the quirky part. There were ancient Greek love spells and magical charms, some of them written by women, meant to seduce, bind, or even control male lovers. Scratched into lead tablets and buried under thresholds, these spells invoke gods and spirits to make a man burn with desire, return home, or be useless in bed with others. Some scholars believe this was the only way wives could reclaim a sliver of sexual power in a culture that denied them a voice. Imagine slipping a tiny curse tablet under your husband's mattress, hoping it might make him a little more attentive, a little more yours. Religion didn't offer much relief either. Greek mythology is filled with predatory gods, vengeful wives, and women punished for the desires of men. Hera is eternally jealous, Aphrodite eternally beautiful, and mortal women rarely end up happy. The divine model of womanhood swings between the cold matron and the wild temptress, with nothing in between. Still, behind closed doors, there's probably more nuance than the records show. Maybe your husband has moments of softness. Maybe he teaches you how to play a lyre or recites a poem when no one's listening. Maybe, on certain nights, after enough wine and before he falls asleep, he turns to you not as a wife but as a person. Or maybe not. Here's the part no one tells you. Despite the cultural silence, your body still feels. You know pleasure, even if it comes in stolen moments, during a bath, in a dream, or when you dare to look too long at the woman who brings bread to the courtyard. You're told to suppress all of it, but some part of you still hums with life, and that hum, that flicker of knowing, is a rebellion all its own. At night, the house quiets. The oil lamp flickers. Your husband snores, turned away. You stare at the ceiling, tracing cracks like constellations. You remember the stories about goddesses who transformed into trees, birds, stars to escape the hands of men. You wonder what you would become if you could choose. A sparrow? A flame? Or maybe you'd just like to stay here, in your body, in your own bed, with someone who asks first. Your sandals clack across polished stone as you enter the atrium of your Roman villa. The air is scented with olive oil, crushed laurel, and the faint bitterness of politics. You are now a Roman wife, somewhere around the 1st century CE, and your married sex life is a fascinating tangle of legal rights, social control, and the constant background hum of patriarchy. Polished to perfection, with marble and rhetoric. You live in a world obsessed with appearances. Behind closed doors, things get messier. You were married young, probably around age 14, in a white tunic with a saffron veil. There was a symbolic torch passed between families, a meal, a procession, and you were led to your husband's home, your new domain. He may have chosen you for your family's connections, your dowry, your hips. But don't expect candlelit poetry. Roman marriages were strategic. The bedroom was one part of a larger plan, a place for reproducing citizens and reinforcing alliances. Here's your historical fact. Under Roman law, a wife technically remained part of her father's family unless the marriage was a manus type, which transferred her legally into her husband's authority. But as the empire expanded, manus marriages became less common. You retained legal ties to your birth family and could, in theory, own property, initiate divorce, and even refuse sex if you had the clout. It sounds empowering. On parchment. In reality, not so much. Your husband holds paterfamilias status, the legal and moral head of the household. That means he can arrange your life with absolute authority, including what happens between the sheets. Legally, he's expected to respect your status, but culturally, you're a vessel, a symbol, a womb in fine linen, and while Roman society was more permissive than some, less shackled by religious taboos, more openly indulgent of pleasure, it was also deeply double-standarded. Let's get specific. You're expected to be pudica, modest, quiet, dignified. A Roman matron didn't speak too freely, laugh too loudly, or enjoy sex too visibly. Your role in bed was to be willing but not wanton. Desire in a wife was suspicious. If you liked it too much, you were labelled libidinosa, a woman too full of lust, and that didn't go over well with the neighbours, or the magistrate. Your husband, meanwhile, is free to seek pleasure elsewhere. Courtesans, slaves, boys, it's all legal, as long as he doesn't overstep certain class boundaries. The important thing is he doesn't shame the family. Fidelity, optional, discretion, required. You're expected to tolerate this. Smile politely, keep the bedsheets clean. But here's the real kicker. The Romans had no problem talking about sex. Erotic poetry, graffiti, mosaics, it's all there. Visit a bathhouse and you'll see phallic carvings pointing toward pleasure rooms. Pick up a copy of Ovid and you'll read advice on how to seduce a married woman step by poetic step. Sex was entertainment, a topic for satire, a frequent theme in public art. Just not for you. Not as a wife. And now for the fringe fact. Roman physicians actually wrote about the importance of female orgasm for conception. Some suggested that if a woman climaxed, it helped suck in the semen. A few even believed that mutual pleasure strengthened the fetus. Wildly unscientific? Yes. But it meant that some Roman husbands may have tried to be considerate lovers. Not out of love, but for eugenics. Talk about mixed motives. Still, many Roman women probably figured out ways to carve out moments of power within the rigid roles. Some left behind letters and inscriptions showing affection and humour. A few even controlled their own wealth and households, especially in the imperial elite. There are tombstones for wives that say things like, "My most faithful companion, equal in virtue and love." Were those just formulaic? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe someone actually meant it. There's an open scholarly debate about how typical that affection really was. Were Roman marriages cold contracts spiced with duty sex and extramarital escapades? Or were there more complex emotional lives buried under the public masks? The sources, written mostly by elite men, don't say. But you can imagine it. Two people surviving the empire together, learning each other's rhythms, sharing jokes over olives and wine, even if no one wrote it down. That said, you still carry a small bottle of herbs meant to dull sensation just in case. Your friend whispers that you can steep pennyroyal in wine to ward off pregnancy. Not entirely effective, but better than nothing. You hear stories of women using wool plugs soaked in honey, or strange ointments rubbed in secret places. It's all dangerous guesswork, but when you have no choice, desperation makes a potent midwife. Tonight your husband returns from the forum with a scowl. He's had a long day arguing about aqueducts or grain shipments. He eats without talking, then gestures for you to follow him. There's no music, no candlelit games, just the soft rustle of linen and the press of expectation. You don't cry. You don't protest. You just do what's expected. Because that's what a Roman wife does. And yet later, when he snores beside you, the wine still on his breath, you think about that mosaic in the atrium. The one of Venus reclining, laughing, surrounded by doves. A goddess who knew her power, her body, her pleasure. You trace the shape of her silhouette in your mind and wonder what it would be like to be wanted like that, Not for airs, not for politics, just because someone saw you, really saw you. The torchlight flickers against stone walls, incense curls in lazy spirals toward the rafters. Somewhere outside a monk chants in Latin, but inside this darkened room the atmosphere feels more like a confessional than a bedroom. You're now a Christian wife in the late Roman Empire, or maybe the early medieval period, somewhere around 400 CE, and you've just found out that sex, even married sex, is now a deeply complicated spiritual transaction. Spoiler: pleasure has officially become a theological problem. You weren't always taught to feel this way. Your grandmother might have grown up in the last days of pagan Rome, where sex was a part of life, art and religion. But your world is different now. With Christianity rising in influence and eventually becoming the dominant state religion, the bedroom has been converted into something far more restricted. Intimacy, once loosely regulated by social norms and power, is now scrutinized by saints. As a wife in this era, you're told your primary role is that of a helpmate, obedient, modest, and chaste, even within marriage. Not chaste in the literal no sex ever sense, that's for the nuns, but chaste in spirit, clean, controlled, dutiful. Sex is allowed, yes, but only within marriage, only for procreation, and ideally with no extra enthusiasm. If you happen to enjoy it, that's a personal spiritual issue you'll need to work out in prayer. Let's talk facts. Church fathers like Augustine had a huge influence on how sex was viewed in Christian doctrine. After his wild youth, Augustine did a dramatic theological about-face and started writing about lust as the corruption of the soul. According to him, even in marriage, sex should be approached cautiously, always shadowed by the awareness of original sin. In other words, if you're lying next to your husband and feeling, say, something, you should probably also be feeling guilt. And this is the beginning of what scholars call the virgin-whore dichotomy. You, as a wife, are expected to occupy the perfect middle ground. Not promiscuous like the sinful women warned about in sermons, but not too sexually assertive either. That's unbecoming for a godly matron. You're meant to be available but not eager, present but not powerful. The ideal Christian wife is obedient and silent, her pleasure unnecessary and even suspicious. But here's the twist. Your husband is also getting the same sermons. In theory, Christian men are expected to treat their wives with love, restraint and mutual respect. One passage in Paul's letter to the Corinthians says, "The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband." That duty includes sexual availability, and yes, it goes both ways. You could, in theory, quote scripture if he tries to deny you affection. But realistically, scripture doesn't always win over power. There's this strange tension running through your life now, a holy war between body and spirit. Sex is not supposed to be sinful within marriage, but it's also not supposed to be fun. If you take too much interest, you risk being seen as morally weak or even demonic. Medieval monks wrote entire treatises on which sexual positions were appropriate, missionary only, what days were acceptable, not Sundays or feast days, and what thoughts were permissible, no imagining thank you. You could be married for 30 years and still be considered impure if you enjoyed yourself too much. Let's pause for a truly bizarre fringe fact. Some penitential manuals, basically sin guides for confessors, included specific punishments for what went on in the marital bed. One 7th century Irish manual listed separate penances depending on the time of day sex was performed, the position, and whether or not the couple enjoyed it. You might be told to fast for weeks because your husband touched your breast on a Tuesday. It's bureaucratic guilt, weaponized with terrifying efficiency. And that leads us to the open scholarly debate. Did women internalize these teachings, or did they quietly resist them? Some believe women of the time fully absorbed the message that sexuality was shameful, especially after centuries of reinforcement through sermons, saints' lives, and legal codes. Others argue that within homes and private spaces, women found ways to reclaim joy, closeness, and even erotic expression, with or without the Church's permission. We have letters, poems, and even bits of devotional writing that hint at tenderness, humour, and emotional intimacy between husbands and wives. You might not talk openly about your feelings, but you know what warmth feels like. You feel it when your husband places a hand on your back without expectation. You feel it when he prays with you, sincerely, before bed. And you definitely feel something, unspoken, primal, when he looks at you with softness instead of ownership. It's rare, but it happens. Still, you're more likely to confide in your confessor than in your spouse, and when you do, you're careful. You whisper that you've been feeling unholy thoughts. You don't say that you miss the way he used to look at you before the sermons got longer. You don't say that sometimes, in the stillness of the night, you touch yourself in a way that makes you feel both powerful and panicked. You just bow your head and accept the assigned prayers, trying to believe that heaven forgives what it created. You might even be one of the lucky ones who stumbles upon a marriage manual, a kind of proto-self-help book written by monks or theologians for couples. Some of them urge men to be kind, not to force, not to humiliate. It's not exactly sexy, but it's something. A whisper of ethics in a world where silence is the only language most wives get to speak. And so you go to bed, in your wool shift beneath linen sheets, with your husband beside you, and the shadow of divine judgment hanging above. He reaches for you, quietly. You nod, and he takes that as yes. He's not cruel, he's not particularly attentive either, but he's yours. And when it's over, and he turns away to sleep, you whisper a prayer, not for forgiveness this time, but for understanding, for a God who might look down and see the fear, the longing, the small rebellion of still wanting something more. You close your eyes. The candle flickers out. The silence returns. The wind howls through the cracks in the wooden shutters. It's cold in your room, colder still in your marriage. You're a peasant wife now, living somewhere in medieval Europe, maybe France, maybe England, maybe the Holy Roman Empire, anywhere between 1000 and 1300 CE. Your husband is snoring, boots still on, and your bones ache from hauling water and beating laundry against stones all day. You'd like to sleep, but you can tell he'll be waking soon, fumbling under the woolen blankets, smelling of ale and dirt, expecting his conjugal rights. Because in this world, the marital bed is less a place of affection and more a shared responsibility, one you don't get to opt out of. You didn't choose this marriage. Your father did. Or maybe your lord arranged it. There were no romantic courtships, no sweet letters or stolen glances. Your wedding was a contract between families or villages, often sealed with a simple meal and a blessing from the local priest. You brought a dowry, probably a goat, a few tools, or the promise of labour, and your new husband brought a roof, maybe even a bit of land if you're lucky. Love? That's something the nobles write songs about, not you. Let's start with the historical fact. In medieval Europe, the Church officially recognised marriage as a sacrament by the 12th century. That means it was holy, ordained by God, and publicly binding. A man and woman were to be one flesh, in body and spirit. This granted married women a few protections, like the right to conjugal relations, and sometimes the ability to contest abandonment. But in practice, that one flesh usually meant your husband's needs, your husband's timing, and your husband's power. And once you were wed, there was no such thing as marital rape, because you were no longer considered to have autonomy over your own body. The irony is brutal. In theory, Christian marriage elevated the status of wives, emphasizing mutual responsibility and spiritual unity. In reality, especially for peasants, it just meant your suffering now had holy branding. Sex was your duty, like tending the fire or feeding the pigs. If you denied your husband, even out of exhaustion or illness, you risked being accused of sin, or worse, of inviting him to seek comfort elsewhere, which would then somehow be your fault too. Privacy? Not a thing. You likely share a one-room house with your children, in-laws, maybe even livestock. If you're lucky, there's a curtain you can pull around your straw bed. But mostly, you learn to be quiet, to make no sound as he climbs in, pulls your shift up and finishes before you can count to 30. He doesn't ask, he doesn't check, and you don't say no, not because you want it, but because you don't want the consequences of refusal. But here's the quirky part. While peasant sex lives were often unromantic, even transactional, medieval clergy were deeply preoccupied with regulating them. Confession manuals got creepily specific. Priests were trained to ask how often you had sex, whether you took pleasure in it, and, yes, what position you used. Spoiler. Only missionary was acceptable. Anything else, and you'd be fasting, praying, or crawling on your knees to penance for months. Meanwhile, the nobility were having their own brand of fun. Up in the castles and manor houses, troubadours sang of courtly love, a chaste but passionate devotion to an unattainable woman, usually someone else's wife. It was emotional, poetic and completely separate from the cold arrangements of actual marriage. So while you're down here boiling linens and nursing an infant while your husband gets handsy after supper, Lady Eleanor up the hill is writing love poetry to her cousin's husband while her own spouse is off crusading. Romance was theatre, marriage was maintenance. Now, let's take a quick detour into the fringes of the medieval sex life. In some communities, especially in urban centres, you might have visited a marriage bed tester before your wedding night. That's right, someone would physically inspect your bed to ensure it was large enough and structurally sound enough for the consummation. If the bed broke, it might be seen as a bad omen, or a testament to your husband's enthusiasm. And that leads us into the open scholarly debate. Were peasant women completely powerless in their marriages, or did they carve out hidden forms of agency? Some evidence suggests rural wives could and did negotiate for better treatment, using family ties, village gossip, or even the threat of church involvement to gain a little leverage. Others argue that the vast imbalance of power and lack of education made true sexual consent impossible. The truth, as always, likely sits somewhere in between. Sometimes, on feast days, your husband drinks too much, and you both collapse laughing into bed after dancing in the mud. Those are the good nights, rare but remembered. Sometimes he softens when you're sick. Sometimes you both stare at the same stars and feel like equals just for a breath. But most nights are a quiet ache. You sleep light, trained to wake at any shift of weight beside you. Your children snore in the corner, curled up like puppies. The fire has burned low, and your husband shifts beside you, his hand already moving toward your hip. You turn toward the wall, press your forehead into straw, and let him. It's easier than saying no, and tomorrow you'll churn the butter, mend the linen, and feed the animals like nothing happened. Because you love your children. You need the roof. And you've learned that survival sometimes sounds like silence. The call to prayer echoes softly from a nearby minaret, the sound rising like mist into the still heat of the night. You sit on a cushion, veiled, combing your oiled hair by lamplight. This time, you're a wife living during the Islamic Golden Age, maybe in Baghdad, Damascus, or Cordoba, somewhere between the 8th and 13th centuries. You've been educated in a way. You can recite poetry. You've read some of the Quran, or at least heard it enough to know the cadence. And now, here in the flickering candlelight, your husband waits for you beyond the curtain. You're expected. But here's the twist. You may actually be wanted too. This is one of the rare historical moments where marriage and sex for women aren't framed solely in terms of silent duty. Don't get too excited. This isn't a modern paradise. But the cultural landscape of the Islamic Golden Age held a unique tension. Rigid patriarchal structures on one hand, and a surprisingly open, and sometimes celebratory, discourse around female pleasure on the other. Welcome to the contradiction. Here's your historical fact. Classical Islamic scholars and jurists, while deeply invested in regulating sexuality, often emphasized mutual satisfaction between spouses. The Prophet Muhammad himself is reported to have spoken of the importance of kindness, foreplay, and sexual pleasure for both partners. One oft-quoted hadith even encourages men not to rush upon their wives like beasts, but to engage them with gentleness and consideration. It's a small detail, but huge in context, because unlike in many other cultures of the time, female sexual pleasure wasn't seen as shameful. It was, in theory, part of a healthy marriage. In theory. Your marriage likely came by arrangement, possibly when you were quite young. You may have joined your husband's household with gold bracelets and silks, or with nothing at all depending on class. The mahr, a bride gift separate from dowry, is legally yours, meant to offer some protection and leverage, and your husband is instructed by Islamic law to fulfill your sexual needs, not just expect his own to be met. If he neglects you, you can, in theory, take that to a judge. It's not about romance, it's about contract, balance, justice. It sounds empowering, but as always, there's a gap between law and lived reality. You're probably veiled in public, modest by design and expectation. Your sexuality is guarded carefully, but it's not erased. In fact, in private, women talk. In the bathhouses, at home, behind thick curtains, wives share stories, advice, complaints, and even bedroom strategies. The idea that women are sexually passive doesn't quite take hold here. If anything, there's a quiet understanding among your peers that you are supposed to feel pleasure. that good sex is not only your right, it's a sign your marriage is working as it should. And then there's the fringe fact. One of the most infamous erotic manuals from the Islamic world, The Perfumed Garden by 𝕭𝖓𝖌, written in the 15th century but drawing from earlier traditions, openly discusses female anatomy, pleasure, orgasms, and sexual compatibility. Entire chapters are devoted to foreplay techniques, and even to warning men against neglecting their wives' desires. Yes, some of it is deeply problematic by modern standards. Yes, it's written by and for men. But it's still a reflection of a culture where these things could be discussed. Openly, without shame. Your husband may have studied such a text, or heard it referenced in courtly poetry. Maybe he has learned that to be a good husband, he must listen, to your body, if not to your words. If he is wealthy, educated, and thoughtful, he may actually try. He may oil your feet, kiss your stomach, whisper verses from Rumi in your ear. If not, you may simply endure, quietly measuring each night by how quickly it ends. And here comes the open scholarly debate. How free were women, really, within Islamic marriage during this period? Some historians point to surviving court records where women sued for divorce, citing sexual neglect. Others highlight the rise of female poets, scholars, and even physicians who wrote about love and desire. But critics argue that these were exceptions, not norms. That for every educated wife in Córdoba, there were hundreds of women in small villages who had no choice, no voice, and no safe exit. You lie on embroidered cushions and listen to the fountain trickling in the courtyard. The air is thick with jasmine. You remember a poem you once heard. She entered my garden, where roses bloomed not from water, but from the fire in her glance. You wonder if the poet's wife ever read those words. You wonder if she was ever the one being written about, or if she, like you, simply lay in the dark and imagined a love that burned, rather than smouldered. Sometimes you want to ask him, do you see me? Not just my body, not just what I can give you, but me. The girl who used to climb the pomegranate tree barefoot. The girl who still loves stories. The girl who sometimes cries after pleasure because it's the only moment she feels real. But you don't ask. You let the silence stretch between you. He reaches for you, and you offer what's expected. Maybe he's gentle tonight. Maybe he listens. Maybe you even enjoy it for a minute, before the voices of your mother, your aunts, your teachers start murmuring in your head again. Modesty, virtue, obedience, duty. Still, somewhere beneath all that, your body remembers it was made to feel. You fall asleep with the scent of oud in your hair, your limbs still warm. Somewhere beyond the walls the moon slips behind a minaret, and another call to prayer rises into the darkness. A reminder that even here, in this complicated world of rules and rituals, there's still a pulse, still a heartbeat, still you. You're adjusting the folds of a velvet gown that weighs more than your dignity. Your bodice is cinched too tight, your breath shallow, and the marriage you're in is about as romantic as a tax audit. Welcome to the Renaissance, somewhere between the 14th and 16th century, depending on who's keeping the calendar, and you're a wife in a well-to-do European household. Maybe Florence, maybe Paris, maybe Venice. Wherever it is, there's art on the walls, wine in the goblet, and absolutely zero tolerance for women wanting anything too loudly, including sex. The Renaissance gets all the credit for sparking genius and creativity, but for married women, let's just say it was less about rebirth and more about repackaging oppression with better paint. You're expected to be beautiful, virtuous, and quiet. The model wife is a Madonna with a good dowry, steady womb, and ideally no opinions. That's your job. Your husband? He gets to be a merchant, a thinker, a lover of art, and sometimes just a lover of someone else. Let's get to the historical fact. Renaissance marriage was still fundamentally a business deal. Families arranged matches for political gain, social advancement, or cold, hard economic security. The dowry system hit peak importance during this era, with some women's entire marital fate riding on how many silk sheets and silver goblets they came with. Love, optional, sex, obligatory. Your consent wasn't exactly part of the ceremony. In many cases, you were a teenager married off to a man in his 30s or 40s, because hey, what says emotional connection, like a 2-decade age gap? But here's where the Renaissance added its own spicy contradiction. While public expectations around marriage emphasized chastity, purity, and control for women, The cultural world exploded with erotic art and literature. If you were a wife, your own sexual identity was kept locked behind doors. But if you were a mistress, suddenly you were the star of the show. Courtesans, especially in cities like Venice and Florence, were educated, charismatic, dressed to kill, and fluent in seduction. They appeared in paintings, poetry, and salons. Meanwhile, you, legally married, socially sanctioned, couldn't even read Boccaccio without someone raising an eyebrow. That's the first slap, the double standard. The second? Your husband probably has one of those mistresses, or he spends time in the company of male apprentices who are conveniently attractive and young. In many elite circles, it's an open secret, and while there are rules on paper, technically adultery is a crime, the reality is that these rules rarely apply to powerful men. If you cheat, though, all bets are off. The punishments range from forced confinement to public shaming, or worse. So even if you're lonely, neglected, or genuinely in love with someone else, your options are limited. Let's drop in a fringe fact here. Some Renaissance marriage guides, yes, they existed, warned men not to be too passionate with their wives, lest they awaken dangerous desires. One Italian treatise even suggested that women who enjoyed sex too much were prone to hysteria, deception, or, gasp, independent thought. The logic went like this. If you're too satisfied, you might realise you don't actually need your husband for happiness, so the answer, keep it clinical, efficient. One scholar referred to this as containment through disinterest. That's right. They basically invented the concept of weaponized boredom. Yet despite all that, people were still people. You still had a body and a brain. You might not have had words like agency or consent, but you had instincts. You could tell when he looked at you like a possession instead of a person. You could tell when his touch was absent, even while his hands were present. And in the quiet hours, behind brocade curtains and beneath your layered skirts, you might have dared to imagine something else. Someone who asked, someone who waited, someone who cared. There's an open scholarly debate about how women navigated their sex lives in this time. Some letters, hidden diaries, and poems suggest that women formed close emotional bonds, sometimes with other women, sharing secrets, comfort, even sensual companionship. Others point out that most of what we know comes from the writings of men, especially clergymen, who weren't exactly known for recording women's pleasures without adding a layer of sin and scandal. Were you a suppressed prisoner of your marriage, or a quiet subversive finding joy where you could? History offers hints, but not clarity. And then there's the art. Oh, the art. Plump nude women lounging with coy smiles, lovers entwined in gardens, Venus rising from seashells, painted by men for male patrons, but still reflective of the culture's deep and selective obsession with beauty and eroticism. You probably see these paintings on your husband's walls. You probably look nothing like them. And even if you did, that version of you isn't supposed to exist in the marriage bed. That version is only allowed on canvas. But here's the secret. Some nights, when the candles are low and the house is still, your husband might come to you not just to take, but to linger. He might brush your hair back, murmur something kind, let his mask slip. You might even laugh together, remembering some early awkward moment. It doesn't make everything better, but it reminds you that the person he once was might still be in there, buried beneath expectations and entitlement. You sleep in a narrow bed, wrapped in heavy fabric and heavier silence. Your husband turns over, pulling the covers with him. You lie awake, eyes tracing the ceiling's cracked plaster, your body still humming with want, not necessarily for pleasure, but for recognition. For the simple joy of being seen, touched, chosen, not as a painting, not as a prize, but as a person. The fire crackles low in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows against the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the wind groans through the branches of the New England woods. It's the 17th century now, and you're a Puritan wife in the American colonies. You pull your wool shawl tighter around your shoulders as your husband closes the Bible with a heavy hand. He's just finished reading from Leviticus. Again. You sit beside him, upright, composed, and painfully aware that tonight, like every other night, your marriage bed is not just a place of intimacy, but a sacred duty monitored by God himself. You've heard the sermons. Sex is not a sin within marriage. In fact, it's commanded, but only within very strict limits. Desire should be restrained. Enjoyment is, Permissible, but suspicious. And if you ever find yourself wanting your husband, you best be sure it's for the right reasons, namely procreation and preserving the sanctity of the household. This is not the land of pleasure. This is the land of self-denial, hard labour and spiritual watchfulness, which is a poetic way of saying sex is a deeply awkward business and you're not allowed to laugh about it. Here's your historical fact. The Puritans actually believed married couples owed one another sexual fulfillment. It's written into the records. In fact, several men were brought before church elders and courts for withholding sex from their wives and were reprimanded or even punished. So, oddly enough, as a wife, you could legally demand sex from your husband. Just don't expect to talk about it in anything but the most solemn hushed tones, probably with the words covenant and godly affection thrown in somewhere. Now that doesn't mean you had control over the experience, far from it. While male infidelity was frowned upon, female adultery was criminal, sometimes punishable by public whipping, branding or exile. If you were caught, it wouldn't just be your marriage that crumbled. It would be your entire standing in the community. And with no property rights or economic independence, being cast out could literally mean death. So you stay, you comply, you obey. Not just for your husband, but because your survival depends on it. And let's not romanticize the bedroom. You're sleeping on a lumpy straw mattress stuffed into a tiny home you share with children, animals and visiting neighbours. Privacy is rare. The fire keeps the chill at bay, but not much else. When your husband turns to you at night, it's usually silent, fumbling, and brief. There's no question of foreplay, not because it's sinful, but because it's not considered. You lie still, whisper a prayer to keep your soul pure, and hope he finishes before the baby starts crying. But here's the quirky fact that no one expects. Some Puritan couples actually wrote love letters, tender, even passionate ones. Surviving notes from colonial America include pet names, romantic affirmations, and laments about being apart. So while the culture around you may be rigid and austere, not every marriage was cold. Some husbands adored their wives, some wives genuinely missed their husbands, and behind the curtain of public piety there might be real affection, maybe even playful touches when no one was looking. That said, the overarching narrative was still control. Women's bodies were not their own. If you bled irregularly, spoke too boldly, or showed too much curiosity, you could be accused of unnaturalness, or worse, witchcraft. And if your neighbour's crops failed or her cow died mysteriously, you might be blamed. Puritan communities were tightly wound, and female sexuality, especially female power, was a source of paranoia. A woman too confident, too sensual, too aware of her own needs, clearly suspicious. And that brings us to the open scholarly debate. Were Puritan women completely oppressed by religious doctrine, or did they quietly shape their own forms of power within those confines? Some historians argue that the home became a space where women exerted moral influence, guiding their families with wisdom and patience. Others suggest that the emotional and sexual repression of the era left deep scars, particularly for women whose roles were reduced to obedience and silence. Tonight your husband is kinder than usual. He presses your hand before bed, murmurs a brief prayer, then lies back with a heavy sigh. You move toward him because it's expected, but also because you want to feel something. Connection, maybe. Recognition. A reminder that you are more than a cook, a laundress, a vessel for children, that you are a person too. Afterward he thanks you, which you've learned to accept as the closest thing to emotional intimacy he knows how to give. You lie awake, staring at the wooden beams above, wondering what it would be like to say no and have it heard as a full sentence, not a challenge to his authority. You remember stories whispered by older women, tales of women who found comfort in each other, who shared quiet moments at the well or in the woods. You don't dare ask questions. But sometimes, when your friend Rachel leans too close and brushes the hair from your face, you feel a strange warmth bloom in your chest. You bury it, deep. Because here, desire, especially yours, is dangerous. It's better to keep your thoughts guarded, your voice low, your footsteps careful. You are a wife. You are a mother. You are a symbol of virtue. You are also exhausted. You sleep with one arm around the baby and the other under your pillow, where you keep a worn scrap of a psalm and a bit of dried lavender, both meant to soothe, though only one ever really works. The wind presses against the shutters again, You close your eyes and prepare for another day, another night. The light filtering through your parlour window is soft and golden, the kind that makes everything look more genteel than it really is. You adjust your silk fichu modestly over your bodice, sip your lukewarm tea, and listen to the clock tick. It's the 18th century now, somewhere in Enlightenment-era Europe, and you are a wife in the age of reason, philosophy, and powdered wigs. Your world is buzzing with talk of liberty, science, and natural rights. But inside the walls of your marriage, let's just say the revolution hasn't reached the bedroom yet. Your husband is a man of intellect. He reads Voltaire. He quotes Rousseau, especially the bits about the natural order of women being nurturing and submissive. He probably talks a great deal about logic and virtue, and he may even believe he respects you in his way. But when it comes to sex, the Enlightenment hasn't exactly illuminated your side of things. You're still expected to do your duty, bear his children, and keep your appetite for anything, especially pleasure, firmly in check. Let's begin with the historical fact. While the 18th century saw tremendous intellectual shifts in Europe, including the rise of companionate marriage, the idea that spouses should also be friends, these ideas were mostly aimed at middle and upper-class men. Women were still largely viewed through the lens of biology and reproduction. Medical texts from this period described female anatomy with absurd confidence, and even more absurd inaccuracy, often claiming women's sexual arousal was unnecessary for conception, or worse, that too much desire could lead to madness or uterine wandering. That's right. The wandering womb theory was still hanging on despite all this enlightenment. You were likely married in your late teens to a man you barely knew but were taught to admire. The wedding ceremony was elegant, the legal papers drawn up with precision, and you were sent into his home like a neatly wrapped parcel of virtue and property. On your wedding night, you were probably terrified, not just because you didn't fully understand what was about to happen, but because no one had ever asked if you wanted it. Now, a few years into marriage, sex is a scheduled event. It's done quietly in the dark, often with you pretending to be asleep or compliant. Not resistant, that would be dangerous, but passive, emotionless. You've learned that to show interest is to invite suspicion. Why would a proper lady want sex? That's for actresses, servants, and the kind of women who get locked away or die tragically in novels. If you enjoy it, you're not respectable, and you, unfortunately, have to be respectable at all times. But here's a fringe fact that cracks through the polished surface of Enlightenment restraint. There were secret writings, underground pamphlets, and even scientific essays that dared to speak of female pleasure. A few early sex manuals, still printed under pseudonyms and hidden from public view, suggested that women had sensitive anatomy, could climax, and might even benefit emotionally and physically from sexual fulfillment. Imagine that. These texts were controversial and almost always dismissed by mainstream scholars, but they existed. Quiet, subversive evidence that not everyone believed you were simply a cold, passive vessel. Still, the dominant message around you was control. Enlightenment thinkers may have questioned monarchy and religion, but they had very little to say about dismantling patriarchy. In fact, many reinforced it. Philosophers argued that men were rational and active, while women were emotional and passive, two complementary halves of society. Translation: he leads, you follow. He speaks, you listen. He desires, you endure. There's an open scholarly debate here. Did Enlightenment-era wives internalize this passive model of sexuality, or did they find ways to reclaim intimacy on their own terms? Some argue that salon culture, letter writing, and the rise of early novels gave women new ways to explore emotional and even sensual experience. Others point out that the overwhelming lack of bodily autonomy and limited legal recourse made true agency nearly impossible. You couldn't even own property independently in many places, let alone say no in your own bed. You might not be beaten or starved, but your body is still not your own. If your husband is gentle, he might ask, "Is this agreeable to you?" But it's a rhetorical question. If you're tired, pregnant, or in pain, he may proceed anyway, because technically, marital consent isn't even a concept yet. You're his wife. That's the consent. The ring is the yes. Every day after that, taken for granted. And yet, you have thoughts, dreams, even desire. When you read certain passages in Richardson's Pamela or Rousseau's La Nouvelle Héloïse, your heart beats a little faster, not because the characters are rebellious, but because they feel something. Because even in fiction, A woman having an inner life is thrilling. You memorize lines of poetry and imagine someone whispering them into your ear. Not your husband, but someone who sees you as more than a polished ornament. Sometimes you touch yourself in the dark, slowly, carefully. You don't have the language for what you're doing, but your body does. You feel the tension, then the relief, and then the guilt. You pray silently, or you blame the wine, or the novel you were reading. But secretly it feels like reclaiming something no one else knows you've lost. You can't say any of this aloud. Your husband might laugh, or worse, be intrigued in all the wrong ways. So instead, you play your part. You kiss his cheek. You lie beneath him. You hold still. And afterward, when he snores beside you, you return to the tiny hidden world in your mind where someone waits for your yes before taking anything. The Enlightenment may have sparked revolutions, but in this house, the candles burn low, the gowns stay heavy, and the bed remains a place where you are expected to be present, but not alive. You lie still, eyes open, counting the seconds until dawn. The corset digs into your ribs, but you're used to that by now. Everything in your life as a Victorian wife is tight. Your waist, your schedule, your smile, your boundaries. It's the 19th century, and you live in a world that worships manners, modesty, and middle-class respectability. On the surface, your marriage looks picture perfect. A well-dressed husband, a tidy home, obedient children, and lace curtains that flutter like a sigh. But behind the floral wallpaper and the piano lessons, married sex has become something so repressed, so awkwardly contorted by morality and silence, it barely feels human. You've heard the advice. You've read, or at least peeked at, the manuals. You know that a proper wife should submit to her husband without complaint or indulgence of the flesh. You're told that your primary role in bed is not to enjoy, but to endure, with grace. Sexual desire in women is often pathologized, treated like a disease of the nerves. You've likely been warned that a woman who feels too much is inviting hysteria, madness, or worse, the disintegration of her virtue. Let's begin with your historical fact. In the Victorian era, female sexuality was redefined through the lens of science, morality, and medicine, all of which seem to agree on one thing: women shouldn't want sex. Medical journals claimed that the ideal woman was naturally asexual, incapable of lust unless corrupted by literature, urban life, or foreign ideas. If you did express desire, a doctor might prescribe rest, a change of scenery, or even send you to a sanatorium. And if you were unlucky, he might suggest a surgical solution. Clitoridectomy was horrifyingly practiced as a cure for female masturbation and mental instability. You've likely never even had the word orgasm spoken to you. If you're from a well-off family, your mother may have whispered vague warnings about a woman's duty. If you're working class, the advice was probably more direct. Just lie back and get it over with. Either way, the result is the same. You walk down the aisle knowing what's expected of you, but not what's coming. On your wedding night, you pretended to sleep. He was nervous too, fumbling with buttons, eyes darting between you and the gas lamp. It hurt, of course. No one told you how much. You bit your lip to avoid crying out. He apologized. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he thanked you. Maybe he said nothing at all. And that's become the rhythm. Silence. Or small practice conversations about everything except what happens at night. You share meals, children, griefs, and victories. But you do not share pleasure. You may not even know what that feels like. And if you do, you keep that knowledge folded up like a secret handkerchief. Precious, private, and slightly shameful. Here's a fringe fact. The now infamous hysteria cure was born during this era. Doctors believed that sexual frustration in women caused nervous disorders, anxiety, and outbursts. The solution: pelvic massage, administered by physicians, in a clinical setting, with the goal of inducing a paroxysm, which is to say, an orgasm, though they'd never call it that. It was all very scientific, of course. So scientific, in fact, that some doctors created early vibrators to speed up the process. Yes, the vibrator was originally a medical device, invented not to empower women, but to save doctors from wrist strain. And yet, despite all this repression, the era was obsessed with sex. You see it in the undercurrents of novels, in the coded language of poetry, in the hidden world of photography and locked drawers of erotic illustrations. While society insists that wives be pure and passionless, the streets teem with brothels. Your husband might visit one on a business trip, You might not even hide it. And society shrugs, because male desire is seen as natural, uncontainable. Yours, a moral flaw. Here's the open scholarly debate. Was the Victorian wife truly frigid, or was she simply performing the only role that let her survive? Some argue that women believed they shouldn't want sex and trained themselves to suppress it. Others say the culture forced them to fake it. Modesty, disinterest, everything, while burning with questions and unmet needs beneath the lace-trimmed surface. Letters, journals, and scandalous court cases suggest there were women who defied the mould. Secret lovers, clandestine affairs, even same-sex romances. But those stories were often erased, dismissed as mental illness or moral collapse. Tonight, your husband knocks softly before entering the room. You sit at your vanity, brushing your hair 100 strokes just as the book advised. He kisses the top of your head, dutiful, mechanical, and asks if you're tired. You always are, but you say no. You turn back the coverlet and lie down, nightgown crisp against your skin. He climbs in beside you, the mattress shifting under his weight. There's no talking, no build-up, just the expected rhythm. When he finishes, he kisses your cheek again and says, "Thank you." You almost laugh, not because it's funny, but because it feels so misplaced. Like thanking a chair for being sat in. You lie still for a long time afterward, staring at the ceiling medallion. It's shaped like a rose. You wonder who picked it. You wonder what it would feel like to be wanted without being thanked. You imagine a world where you could ask him what he thinks about your body, where you could say slower, or wait, or even no, without causing offence, where you could whisper, "I like that," and not worry he'll think you're corrupted. You imagine lighting a candle just because it makes you feel beautiful, not because it's time to prepare for him. You drift off thinking about warmth, not his, but your own. A heat that comes from somewhere deeper than duty. Something real. The city air is thick with soot and steam, and you've got the ache in your spine to prove it. It's the late 1800s now, maybe the 1880s or 90s, and you're living in a 2-room tenement in an industrial city, or maybe in a quiet farmhouse miles from the nearest shop. Either way, you're married, exhausted, and managing a household that runs on hard labour and hope. The day starts before the sun and ends long after the lamps are blown out. Sex isn't something you talk about. It just happens, like milking the cow or peeling potatoes or scrubbing the laundry raw in a metal basin. Necessary, predictable, draining. You're not a lady of leisure. You don't have lace gloves or fainting couches. You have calloused hands, worn shoes, and a husband who works with his body as much as you do. And maybe he's kind, or maybe he's not. Maybe he drinks away his wages, or maybe he reads you the newspaper in the evenings. Either way, he expects you to be available when he wants you. Not because he's cruel, necessarily, but because that's just the way it is. Here's your historical fact. By the end of the 19th century, married women in most Western countries still had no legal right to refuse sex. Marital rape wasn't recognised. It was considered legally impossible because, as the logic went, marriage was permanent consent. You said, "I do" once, and that was supposed to cover everything that came after, indefinitely. No matter how you felt, no matter how tired you were, no matter what he did or didn't do for you. You've probably given birth more than once already, each time with minimal help and no pain relief. Childbearing is expected, unavoidable. You've buried at least one child, or know someone who has. You might have even asked your midwife quietly if there's a way to stop the babies from coming. She handed you a sprig of rue or a folded bit of paper with strange instructions, maybe something about standing on your head or drinking vinegar. You tried it. It didn't work. Your body isn't just a place of sex, it's a place of survival, and every pregnancy is a reminder that the price of intimacy is 9 months of labour and the possibility of death. Your husband may not understand that risk, or maybe he does, and avoids your eyes afterward. But he doesn't stop. You share a bed, or maybe just a mattress on the floor. The kids sleep in the next room, or the same one if space is tight. There's no privacy, only lowered voices and carefully timed movements. You wait until the littlest one's finally asleep before you turn on your side, and he touches your hip to ask. Not with words, but with habit. And you say yes, not because you feel desire, but because it's easier than no, and because, in the morning, there will be porridge to make, a fire to tend, clothes to wash. If you refuse, you'll still have to do all of that, plus navigate his silence or his anger. Still, There are odd glimmers. A night when he brings home a ribbon from the market. A moment when you both laugh over a memory, your hands brushing at the table, a warm palm on your back while you stir soup. These moments don't cancel the rest, but they make it easier. You hold on to them. Let's take a turn into the fringe fact. In this era, there was a growing underground of women sharing marriage advice through pamphlets, letters, and eventually early women's clubs. In some of these discussions, veiled references were made to controlling the frequency of marital relations. Euphemisms like managing the marital rhythm or timing the conjugal approach were passed discreetly between wives. Some women began using homemade pessaries, early versions of diaphragms, made from beeswax or sponge. Risky, yes. But when your life is one long repetition of cooking, cleaning, and childbearing, controlling anything becomes a lifeline. Meanwhile, urban husbands had a different set of choices. Brothels thrived, especially in growing industrial cities. If your husband was away often, you worried about more than just money. Disease, too. Syphilis was rampant. And because no one wanted to believe a married man could bring such things home, if you started showing symptoms, the blame could easily fall on you. Some women were institutionalized for what were likely sexually transmitted infections, labeled hysterics or moral degenerates. And that brings us to the open scholarly debate. Was the divide between respectable wife and sexual woman truly rigid, or did everyday women blend these identities in quiet rebellion? Did they simply endure, or did they shape the boundaries of their marriages through subtle resistance? There are hints in letters and memoirs, brief mentions of withholding favours, sleeping in the parlour, or prayers for protection. Not open refusal, but negotiation, quiet control. Tonight you tuck in the children and stretch your back by the stove. Your husband's already in bed, boots off, waiting. You finish your tasks slowly, not to stall, but to preserve the last scraps of the day that are yours alone. When you climb into bed, you feel the familiar shift, his hand, his breath, his assumption. You close your eyes, not out of passion, but out of resignation, or maybe ritual, or maybe on some small tired level comfort. Tomorrow the same, and the next day. But for now, you rest your hand on your belly and silently beg the sky. Not this month. Please, not again. Outside, a train whistles. Somewhere, a factory bell rings. And you, curled beneath threadbare blankets, dream not of romance or escape, but of a room of your own, a lock on the door, and the ability to choose. The ceiling fan creaks lazily overhead, doing very little to push back the thick colonial heat. You sit on the edge of a rough wooden bed, hands in your lap, and try not to let your expression betray you. It's the early 1900s, and you're a wife, maybe in British India, or French Indochina, or the American South. Wherever you are, the rules of marriage weren't written by women like you. Your sex life, like your land, your language, and your labour, is not fully yours. You live in a world carved up by empires, and inside your home, that same hierarchy plays out under the sheets. Your husband might be white, or he might not be. But if you're a colonised woman, you know your body exists at the crossroads of race, gender, and power. Marriage, in this context, is less about intimacy, and more about dominance, both personal and political. You were probably married young, chosen for your obedience, your appearance, or the alliances your family could offer. You had no say. You were traded like land, fertile, quiet, and expected to produce. Let's start with your historical fact. During the colonial period, especially under systems like British rule in India or Jim Crow in the American South, women of colour were often denied even the limited protections that white wives received. In the British Empire, for example, colonial laws allowed for different legal standards depending on your race, religion, or region. That meant your husband could beat you, imprison you, or rape you, and colonial courts might call it custom. Even when missionaries preached about Christian marriage as a civilizing force, they still upheld patriarchal domination. The church said, love your wife, but what they really meant was, control her nicely. You might live in a mission compound or on a plantation, or in a stone house passed down from your husband's father. Either way, you walk through its halls like a tenant, not an owner. The bedroom, when it's just you and him, becomes a performance. You're expected to be willing, never wanting. There's no space to explore what you enjoy because your pleasure isn't the point. What matters is that he's satisfied, and that the children keep coming. Preferably sons. preferably light-skinned. Here's the fringe fact. Colonial governments often regulated interracial sex with absurd obsession. In French colonies, for instance, marriages between colonizers and local women were sometimes encouraged early on, but only until too many mixed-race children were born. Then the pendulum swung, and such unions were banned, criticised, or quietly erased. In British colonies, native wives were sometimes permitted informally, but never legally recognised. So if your husband is European and you're not, your sex life might be treated as scandalous one moment and invisible the next. Even when married, you're still somehow the other, exotic, tamed, useful. And the open scholarly debate here? It's about consent, real, meaningful, enthusiastic consent, in marriages shaped by systemic inequality. Did women like you ever want what happened in the bedroom, or did they simply accept it as inevitable? Some historians argue that colonized women found subtle ways to assert power, refusing certain advances, spacing out births, or withholding emotional intimacy. Others point to letters, trial records, and diaries where women describe enduring humiliation, violence, and the suffocating weight of cultural erasure. The truth is both, resistance and submission, tangled in the same breath. You might have tried local remedies to delay pregnancy, herbs, heat, prayers whispered to ancestors or saints. You may have sought help from other women, those older and bolder, who told you how to close your legs without closing your marriage. Maybe you cried during childbirth. Maybe you stopped crying altogether. Maybe you started to believe that your silence was safety. Tonight your husband returns smelling of tobacco and foreign policy. He says little. You serve him tea, kneel to untie his shoes, and listen as he mutters about the heat, the governor, the natives. You are native. You say nothing. He goes to bed early, beckons you with 2 fingers. You slip beside him. You stare at the ceiling while he climbs over you, not roughly, but not kindly either. You've learned how to tilt your hips just enough to get it over with faster. You've memorized the pattern of his breathing, the moment when it's safe to go numb. Afterward he falls asleep instantly. You lie awake, wondering if this counts as love or just habit. You think of the women in the kitchen, of your mother, of the girls who ran away to join rebels or take jobs in the city. You envy their motion. Your stillness has become your armour. In the moonlight, you trace the scar from your second childbirth. You remember how you almost died. You remember the midwife's face, drawn and afraid, the way she whispered, "You're strong, stronger than he knows." You clung to those words like prayer, like breath. Outside, the jungle chirps and buzzes, or maybe it's just the wind rattling through cotton fields. Wherever you are, the land has never been fully yours. Neither has your body, but you keep going. You keep waking. You keep surviving. And sometimes, on the rare nights when he's away, you lie in the bed alone. You stretch. You breathe. You remember what it feels like not to be touched, not to be watched, just to exist. You tug your gloves a little tighter as you approach the meeting hall, your steps quick but controlled. There's a flurry of skirts, the sharp scent of ink and coal smoke in the air, and a distant hum of voices sharpening into chants. You're a wife, yes, but you're also something else now. It's the early 20th century, and you've joined the rising tide of women demanding not just votes, but visibility. Welcome to the era of early feminism, and the quiet, fiery rebellion happening not just in parliament buildings or picket lines, but behind closed bedroom doors. You still cook, clean, mother and manage. But now, you're also thinking, reading, questioning. You've started writing letters to newspapers and passing along pamphlets at the market. You've attended suffrage meetings by candlelight and listened to women stand up and speak in ways your grandmother never dared. You might not say it aloud just yet, but deep down, you're starting to believe that sex within marriage shouldn't just be something done to you. It should be something you get to decide, maybe even something you enjoy. That's not an easy idea to hold in this world. Your husband is likely progressive enough to let you march, maybe even support your right to vote. But when it comes to your body, his wife, his politics get a little more traditional. He still expects access. He still believes that marriage comes with certain guarantees. And when you try to bring it up, maybe during a quiet evening after the children have gone to bed, he grows uncomfortable, maybe defensive. "You're my wife," he says, confused. "Isn't that enough?" Here's your historical fact. In the early 20th century, the first real challenges to marital sexual norms began to emerge in public discourse, thanks to early feminist activists and reformers. Women like Margaret Sanger in the United States started to link reproductive rights to sexual autonomy, arguing that birth control wasn't just about preventing pregnancy, it was about giving women choice. Around the same time, campaigners in Britain and Europe began speaking more openly about the marriage question. Should a woman be obligated to have sex simply because she's married? Your answer? Increasingly it's no, or at least not always yes. But the laws aren't on your side. Marital rape still isn't recognised anywhere in the Western legal system. Consent, as a concept, doesn't exist between husband and wife in the eyes of the court. Your husband can force himself on you and the law will shrug. Doctors might even advise him to, especially if you've grown cold or nervous. And if you're caught trying to refuse or avoid, the blame is often yours. Too stubborn, too emotional, too radical. That word's getting thrown around a lot these days. Still, something is shifting. You read articles by other women describing the same exhaustion, the same numbness, the same flickers of rage when expected to perform intimacy like a chore. Some write about marital rape in hushed, hypothetical tones. Some suggest women's separate bedrooms or delay affection with headaches or invented illnesses. A few go further. One writer dares to say, "A woman is not a passive recipient of her husband's will. She is a sovereign in her own body." You clip that quote and hide it in your journal. Here's a fringe fact for you. Some early feminist collectives actually held sexual self-determination discussions, where women, mostly middle class and white, sat in circles and talked about what pleasure meant, what they were afraid to ask for, and how often they simply endured. One London group even published an anonymous booklet about wifely negotiations, offering coded advice for how to gently but firmly say no. Not exactly Kama Sutra, but a revolution in its own way. And yet, there's still that scholar-debated tension. Were these feminists advocating for sexual liberation in marriage? Or was sex still seen as a tool of male oppression, to be minimised or avoided? The early feminist movement was divided. Some argued that a just marriage included mutual desire. Others believed the only path to freedom was through abstinence or celibacy. What they shared, however, was the belief that you should not be reduced to a vessel. You lie in bed tonight beside your husband, unsure what kind of silence this is. He's turned away, not angry, but distant. You told him earlier that you were tired, and you were, but also you didn't want to fake it again. He said nothing, just nodded too quickly and left the room. You know he loves you. You know he works hard. But you also know he doesn't fully understand what it's like to be touched when you don't want to be, simply because you share a name. You turn on your side, curl your knees to your chest, and wonder if other women feel this complicated too. If other wives lie here thinking about consent, not just in the political realm, but in the quiet spaces where no one's watching. You want him, but you want it to come from you. You think of the flyers stacked under your bed. One of them says, in bold type, "Women are not possessions." You smile, bitterly. You believe it. You just haven't figured out how to live it yet, in your own home, in your own body. Maybe tomorrow you'll talk again. Maybe you'll say, "I want us to be equals in every way." Maybe he'll listen, or maybe he'll walk away, muttering about how you've been reading too much. Either way, you'll keep going, keep reading, keep believing that your body doesn't need permission to belong to itself. The night is long, the fight is quiet, but it has begun. Your hem swings as you dance, silk stockings whispering against each other beneath your new dress, shorter than your mother would approve of. The room is filled with jazz, clinking glasses, and the faint buzz of electric possibility. It's the 1920s now, and you're a wife in the age of lipstick, locomotion, and liberation. You've bobbed your hair, tossed your corset, and maybe, just maybe, you've started to believe that sex could be something more than obligation. It could be fun, flirty, even yours. You weren't raised to think like this. You grew up hearing that a good woman says yes quietly and says no even quieter. But then came the war. The world cracked open. You took a job. You kissed a soldier goodbye. You started reading magazines that talked about modern marriage and taking charge of your own happiness. Now you lie beside your husband, maybe one you chose for love, and you wonder if the world has changed enough to let you be honest about what you want, about wanting at all. Here's your historical fact. The 1920s marked a visible shift in how society spoke about married sex. Psychologists like Freud, controversial, yes, but influential, introduced the idea that female sexuality was real and complex, not just a passive reaction to male desire. Popular media began using terms like marital intimacy and companionate marriage, suggesting that spouses should be friends, lovers, and equals. It was a radical concept after centuries of female silence. The marriage manuals on your shelf no longer read like sermons. They include phrases like mutual satisfaction and even emotional connection. But don't mistake the lip rouge and jazz tunes for full freedom. The old rules are still clinging to the walls, especially at home. Your husband might be progressive in theory, maybe he says he supports women's rights, but in bed, he still expects you to perform the part, to be soft and yielding, responsive but not too enthusiastic. If you're too eager, you might seem unladylike, too passive, and you're cold. You live in the narrow space between virgin and vamp, trying not to fall too far toward either extreme, and still you're beginning to experiment. Maybe not openly, not in polite company, but late at night, when you're alone, you try things. You ask him to touch you differently. You roll on top. You laugh during sex. You realize your body can do things you were never told it could. There's pleasure to be found here, not just for him, but for you. And it feels dangerous. It feels like a secret worth protecting. The fringe fact? Some women during this era turned to the new field of psychoanalysis to talk about their marriages, and found themselves, for the first time, naming the emptiness they felt in their sex lives. They described being disconnected, tired, afraid of being used. And while the Freudian response was often patronizing or laced with theories about penis envy, these sessions cracked open a new space where women could speak, even imperfectly, about the way sex in marriage didn't always feel loving, or consensual, or safe. Your husband might be one of the good ones. Maybe he asks questions. Maybe he holds your hand afterward. Maybe he actually listens when you say no. But even in the best-case scenario, there are limits. The law still doesn't recognize your right to bodily autonomy within marriage. If you're injured during sex, if he coerces you, if he uses your body against your will, there's no court that will take your side. You're his wife. The assumption of consent is baked into the vows, every night, every time, and yet the culture around you is buzzing with double meanings. Songs croon about making whoopee. Novels hint at affairs and desires that wives feel but rarely name. You see it in the films too, in the smoky glances and the daring women who leave husbands that don't understand them. It's all fantasy, of course, but fantasy you're learning is a kind of compass. It points to what's missing. There's an open, scholarly debate here. Did the 1920s bring actual change to women's sex lives in marriage, or just the illusion of it? Some historians argue that companionate marriage gave women more power and room to express desire. Others claim it just rebranded old power dynamics with modern language, polished up submission, and called it progress. The truth, like your life, is probably both. Tonight, you come home from the dance hall, cheeks flushed from more than just the Charleston. Your husband looks at you differently when you laugh. There's admiration in his eyes, maybe even affection. He kisses you, and for once it's not a prelude to routine, but something curious, something new. You don't flinch, you don't freeze, you meet him halfway. Later in bed you dare to guide his hand, just gently, just once. He hesitates, then tries again. He doesn't say anything, but he doesn't stop you either. You close your eyes and feel your own body answer, not out of duty, not out of fear, but out of something that's been buried under layers of lace and silence for generations. When it's over, he reaches for your hand and holds it. No thank you, no silence, just a breath shared in the dark. You stare at the ceiling, surprised at the feeling spreading through your chest. Not ecstasy, not rebellion, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, this time, you were there too. The wind outside carries the hum of a new decade coming. You wonder what it will bring. You hope, quietly, fiercely, that it brings more nights like this. You smooth your skirt over your knees as you sit on the floral couch, the cushions worn just enough to feel familiar. It's the 1950s now. Your house smells faintly of lemon polish and instant coffee. The children are finally asleep. Your husband is upstairs shaving, and the television murmurs in the background. Some sitcom where the wife is always smiling and the husband always knows best. You're a married woman in post-war suburbia, and while everything around you screams comfort and normalcy, Your body hums with a quiet discontent you don't quite have the words for. You've done everything right. The house is clean, the roast was on the table by 6, the kids are doing well in school, you iron his shirts, you wave to the neighbours, you keep the fridge stocked and your lipstick fresh, and when it's time for bed you lie still beneath floral sheets and do your part, because you love him, because he's a good man, because this is what a good life looks like, right? Here's your historical fact. In the post-World War II era, particularly in the United States and other parts of the West, there was an aggressive cultural push toward domesticity. After the upheaval of the war, the message was clear. Come home, settle down, build a family. And women, many of whom had worked in factories or offices during wartime, were strongly encouraged, pressured really, to return to the role of wife and mother. Marriage rates soared, so did birth rates, but sexual satisfaction, that stayed politely behind the curtain. Marriage manuals told you to keep your husband happy, not through conversation or emotional support, but by keeping him well fed, admired, and sexually satisfied. The assumption was that men had needs, and women had responsibilities. You were expected to perform your wifely duty, even if you were tired, sick, or disinterested. Because if you didn't, well, there was always the secretary at the office, or the neighbour, or worse, your failure might somehow unravel the entire household. Enter the fringe fact. Many women of the time were diagnosed with what doctors called housewife syndrome, a vague bundle of symptoms including anxiety, depression, fatigue, and insomnia. The cause? Often ignored. The treatment? Usually sedatives. Valium prescriptions exploded in the 1950s and 60s, marketed as the solution for women who felt overwhelmed by the very roles they were told to find fulfillment in. You were told that if you felt numb or sad or sexually unresponsive, the problem was in your nerves, not your marriage. And what about pleasure? That was a tricky subject. Some sex manuals began to cautiously suggest that wives might enjoy sex too, if their husbands were gentle, if the timing was right, if everything lined up perfectly like a page in Good Housekeeping. But orgasms were still taboo in polite conversation, especially for married women. If you enjoyed it too much, you risked seeming vulgar. If you didn't enjoy it at all, you were simply frigid, a cold word that blamed you for everything the marriage lacked. There's an open scholarly debate about whether this period represented a genuine sexual drought for women, or whether the dissatisfaction was just more visible because of rising awareness and emerging psychology. Some argue that behind closed doors many wives had fulfilling sex lives, they just didn't talk about it. Others believe the pressure to conform to a rigid domestic ideal made it nearly impossible for women to claim their sexuality without guilt or fear. Tonight your husband comes down in his robe and turns off the television. He looks at you and smiles. You smile back. It's automatic, the way you were taught. He reaches for your hand gently, and you already know what's coming. You climb the stairs together, and when you reach the bedroom you turn off the lamp because that's what you always do. The darkness is easier. He kisses you softly. He isn't rough. He isn't cruel. He's just there. You close your eyes and think about the dishes still in the sink. You think about the PTA meeting tomorrow. You think about the neighbour's new car. Anything but your body. Anything but this moment. It doesn't hurt, but it doesn't feel like anything either. Just something to get through. And maybe that's the part you hate the most, not the act itself, but the absence, the lack of connection, the way your skin feels like someone else's. Afterward, he rolls over and falls asleep content. You lie awake, staring at the ceiling with its perfect plaster swirl. You wonder if other wives feel this too, that low ache of invisibility, not just sexually, but emotionally, as if your entire life is a performance written by someone else, and your lines were memorized before you ever got to ask why. In the quiet, you remember a line from a magazine you secretly clipped. A woman is more than her home. You keep it tucked in your recipe box between the chicken casserole and the lemon pie. You read it sometimes when you feel too small to ask for more. You roll onto your side and try to sleep. Tomorrow you'll bake, fold laundry and say yes again when asked. But tonight, just for a moment, you picture what it would be like to say no. Not angrily, not dramatically, just no. And to have that be enough. You open the little plastic case and pop the pill onto your tongue. It's 1965 and it feels like you're doing something revolutionary. Even if you're just standing at your bathroom sink in your modest suburban home, you're a wife still, a mother, still ironing your husband's shirts, still making dinner from a can, still waving at the neighbours like everything's perfectly normal. But now, thanks to this tiny tablet, there's something new in your life. Control. For the first time, your sex life isn't just a conveyor belt to another pregnancy. For the first time, you get to choose when, or if, you become a mother again. And that, in your world, changes everything. The birth control pill doesn't magically make sex feel free or joyful overnight. It doesn't undo generations of silence or unspoken obligation, but it cracks open a door. One that many women like you are already starting to peek through. You're not alone. Millions of women are taking the pill now, quietly, behind closed medicine cabinets, or with whispered approval from their doctors. It's still controversial, still considered morally dangerous by churches and politicians, but it's here, and it's yours. Here's your historical fact. The FDA approved the first oral contraceptive in 1960, and by the mid-1960s, it had become one of the most widely used forms of birth control in America and parts of Europe. But for married women, it did more than prevent pregnancy. It offered the first real chance at sexual autonomy in the modern age. No more douching with vinegar, no more praying after the fact, no more pretending you didn't care if you got pregnant again, even when you were still bleeding from the last delivery. Of course, not everyone's cheering. Some husbands are threatened by this newfound control. Some assume that if you're on the pill, you're planning to cheat, or that you'll suddenly become sexually ravenous and uncontrollable, as if your desire was something dangerous now unleashed. Others see it as a convenience, a quiet way to keep the bedroom available without the stress of cribs and bassinets. Still, most aren't asking how you feel, whether the pill changes anything for you, and it does, just not in the ways they expect. At first, you don't know what to do with this freedom. It doesn't make sex automatically better. You've spent decades lying still, saying yes out of habit, enduring instead of exploring. But now that the fear is gone, the ever-present anxiety of more babies, more diapers, more risk, you start to wonder, what if I wanted this? What if it didn't feel like a transaction, or a duty, or something to be traded for peace? Here's your fringe fact. Some of the early developers and funders of the birth control pill had radically different motivations. Margaret Sanger, a known advocate for reproductive rights, saw it as a tool for liberation. But others saw it through a more eugenic lens, believing it would help control populations they deemed unfit for reproduction. So even your private revolution comes with a shadow. The freedom you're holding was shaped in part by people who didn't always see women, especially poor or non-white women, as deserving of full autonomy. Liberation, it seems, is never clean. Still, there's no denying something's changing. More women are entering the workforce. Feminist voices are getting louder. Books like The Feminine Mystique are on your reading list now, maybe tucked inside a cookbook, but still there. You're starting to hear that it's okay to want sex, that you're not broken if you crave more than just Missionary in the Dark once a week. Some women's magazines even publish articles, shocking, about the female orgasm, about communication, about exploring your own pleasure. You read those pages with a racing heart, your fingers cold with excitement and fear. You try to bring it up tentatively with your husband. Do you ever think about trying something different? He frowns, confused. Different how? He asks, not unkindly, but not openly either. You drop it. It's too hard, too strange to say aloud. But the question hangs between you now, suspended like cigarette smoke in the bedroom air. There's an open, scholarly debate here. Did the pill really give married women more power in their sex lives, or did it just make them more sexually available to their husbands, with fewer consequences? Some argue it gave men an easier way to demand sex, knowing there'd be no accidents. Others insist that for many women, it was a gateway drug, not to promiscuity, as critics feared, but to agency, to understanding that their bodies were not public property, that they could say yes for themselves, not because someone else expected it. Tonight you take your pill with a glass of water, tuck your hair behind your ears, and go to bed early. He follows an hour later. You're awake when he slips in beside you. You both lie there for a minute, quiet. Then his hand finds your shoulder, gentle, testing. You turn toward him, not out of duty this time, but curiosity. This time you say, "Wait, can we talk first?" He pauses, blinks, but he nods. You tell him what you read, about touching differently, about slowing down, about wanting it to feel like something shared, not something performed. He doesn't fully get it, but he listens. That's enough, for now. When you kiss, it feels less like a schedule and more like a decision. Yours. When you undress, it's slower, less habitual, less scripted. The light stays on a little longer, and afterward, you feel still awake, still present, not used, not thanked, just there, in your own skin, without apology. You turn onto your back and stare at the ceiling, a small smile curling under your breath. For the first time in years, you don't wonder if you'll get pregnant. You don't wonder if it was worth it. You don't wonder if you're normal. You just feel. And you let that be enough. You sit cross-legged on a shag rug, barefoot, sipping lukewarm herbal tea from a chipped mug that says, "Sisterhood is powerful." The incense is choking the air, the record player is stuck on Joni Mitchell, and there's a consciousness-raising circle happening in your living room. It's the 1970s now. You're still married, still juggling kids, dishes, and laundry. But now, you're also angry, and awake, and finally talking to other women about the thing no one ever let you say out loud. Sex in marriage often feels like something done to you, not with you, and that's not okay. Tonight the women in your circle are talking about desire, or the lack of it. One says she fakes it every time. Another hasn't had sex in 6 months and feels relief more than resentment. Someone else says her husband thinks she's broken because she doesn't orgasm during intercourse. You all laugh, but it's not a light laugh. It's sharp, tired, and a little hollow. Then someone, bolder than the rest, says, "What if the problem isn't us? What if the whole model of marriage is broken?" You blink, then breathe. You've been thinking that exact thought for years, but no one ever told you it was okay to say it out loud. Here's your historical fact. During the 1970s, the second wave feminist movement took direct aim at sex and marriage. Books like Our Bodies, Ourselves exploded into the mainstream, offering women plain-spoken, honest information about their bodies, anatomy, orgasms, and consent. For the first time, women were seeing diagrams that didn't come from a medical textbook or a husband's assumptions. They were learning that their clitoris existed, and that it mattered. That sex wasn't just supposed to be bearable, or even just reproductive. It was supposed to be pleasurable, radically so. You buy a copy and read it at night, highlighter in hand, cheeks burning. Not because you're ashamed, but because everything in it makes sense. You realise that the numbness you've been living with isn't a defect. It's a consequence of years of silence and obligation. You start wondering what sex would feel like if it didn't come with guilt, fear, or scripts written by men who never asked how you felt. The fringe fact. Feminist activists in the 70s didn't just talk, they organised. They hosted workshops where women sat in circles with mirrors and flashlights to look at their own vulvas. Not for titillation, not for shame, but for knowledge. They mapped their own anatomy, named their own parts, reclaimed their own narratives. One collective published a guide to feminist sexual technique, which, yes, sounds ridiculous now, but was a lifeline for women who had never even said the word clitoris aloud. You didn't attend one of those workshops, not yet, but you think about it. A lot. Meanwhile, at home things are shifting, but clumsily. Your husband is trying. He read something in Cosmopolitan about female pleasure zones. He bought scented candles. He doesn't quite understand, but he wants a gold star for effort. When you try to explain that foreplay isn't just a prelude, but part of the main event, he listens, then asks, "So, what do I do?" And that's the frustrating part. You want him to care. You also want him to get it without you having to teach every lesson like a personal tutor. The open scholarly debate here is whether this wave of sexual activism actually improved things in bedrooms, or just moved the goalposts. Some argue that women were empowered to speak up and expect more, while others say that the pressure to be sexually liberated became its own kind of burden. If you weren't having great, frequent, multi-orgasmic sex, were you failing at feminism? The double bind just changed costumes. You lie in bed beside your husband, your body humming with a mix of frustration and cautious hope. You've started saying no more often, gently, but firmly. And when you do say yes, you've started asking for what you want. Sort of. In code. You say, "Not like that," or "maybe slower," or "try this instead." You're still learning the vocabulary of your own pleasure. It's awkward, but it's something. Tonight, after the kids are asleep, he comes to you with hesitation, not assumption. He asks, "Is now okay?" You say, "Maybe." He waits. That alone is progress. You kiss him, not because you have to, but because you want to see if the spark is still there. And it is. Dim, maybe, but not dead. He's still clumsy, but you've learned how to steer without bruising his ego. When he finishes too soon, he actually says, "Did you?" And this time, he means it. You haven't, but you're touched that he asked. You take his hand and guide it, slowly, with intention. You don't perform, you focus. And when it happens, your breath catching, your fingers tightening around the sheets, you don't feel shame. You feel seen. You feel like this moment, small and imperfect, belongs to you. Afterward, he wraps his arms around you, not to claim, just to hold. You stare at the ceiling, thinking about your circle. You wonder how many other women are lying in bed at this very moment, whispering new truths to themselves in the dark. You think about the mirror you bought but haven't used. Maybe tomorrow, maybe soon. You close your eyes with a strange, unfamiliar sensation blooming in your chest. Not ecstasy, not pride. Something quieter. Possibility. You pull the blind shut, double-check the lock and turn the volume down on the TV, not because you're watching something inappropriate, but because you're about to have a serious conversation with your teenage daughter about sex. You're married, you're tired, and it's the mid-1980s. Madonna's on the radio, Ronald Reagan's on the screen, and somewhere between the two, your own marriage is drifting into a fog of routine, avoidance, and occasionally awkward attempts at date night that involve microwave popcorn and falling asleep halfway through a movie. You're a wife in the era of shoulder pads, VHS tapes, and moral panic. Your sex life, like your living room, is decorated in beige and compromise. You still sleep beside your husband every night. You still kiss him goodbye in the morning. But lately intimacy feels more like an obligation than a desire, a pattern worn thin from decades of mixed messages and unmet needs. Here's your historical fact. In the 1980s, the conversation around sex became louder, more political, and significantly more fearful. The AIDS crisis changed everything. What had felt like a fragile breakthrough in sexual openness during the 70s was suddenly throttled by fear, stigma, and a wave of moral conservatism. The idea that sex could be joyful, empowering, even radical, was replaced with anxiety, public service announcements, and reintroduced abstinence campaigns. For married couples, the fear was subtler, but it was there. Suddenly the phrase safe sex wasn't just for teenagers or gay men. It was for everyone. You remember seeing the headlines, the images of gaunt men in hospital beds, the stories about patient zero. You didn't think it had anything to do with you at first. You were married, monogamous, suburban. But then came the whispers. A friend whose husband had a midlife crisis and brought something home. A co-worker who got divorced, dated again, and got sick. You started wondering just how safe your marriage really was. Your husband, for his part, probably doesn't know what to do with this new era of sexual accountability. He grew up being told that marriage was a sexual free pass. Do it as often as you like, however you like, as long as it's with your wife. Now, you're pulling back. Not out of rejection, but self-preservation. You want connection, yes, but on your terms. Not out of fear, but out of choice. You want touch that feels like trust, not just access. And yet, no one gives you a script for how to renegotiate sex after 20 years of marriage. No one teaches you how to unlearn everything you were told about your role as a wife. You were raised in the 1950s, came of age during the 60s, stretched your wings in the 70s, and now, in the Reagan years, you're expected to tuck it all back in. Be decent. Be traditional. Don't rock the boat. Here's a fringe fact. In 1983, the US Department of Health and Human Services released one of the earliest government-sponsored sex education videos for married couples. It featured clean-cut actors talking about mutual respect and shared responsibility, but the subtext was clear. Sex could be dangerous, even in marriage, even when you thought you were doing everything right. The idea that sex needed to be safe was revolutionary and quietly terrifying. It wasn't just about disease. It was about facing the fact that your husband might not be the person you thought he was, or that you might not be either. The open scholarly debate of the time, and still today, is whether the fear-based messaging of the 80s helped or hurt women's sexual agency. Some argue it encouraged caution and empowered wives to ask questions. Others believe it pushed women back into silence, afraid of being labelled promiscuous, or worse, of being blamed for something they didn't even understand. You fall somewhere in between, wary, watchful, wishing you had more answers. Tonight your husband brushes against you while you're folding laundry, a hand on your back, tentative. You tense. It's not that you don't want him. You miss wanting him. But you're tired. Not just from the kids and the job and the bills. Tired from pretending that sex is always simple, that it doesn't carry history or politics or fear. Still, you let him kiss you. You turn and kiss him back. Slowly. Not automatically. You remember when kissing felt like a beginning, not just a checkpoint. Later in bed, he asks, "Are you okay?" He doesn't mean just tonight. He means generally. You pause, then nod. "I think so." It's not a lie, but it's not the whole truth. He squeezes your hand. "I know it's been weird lately," he says. "I'm here if you want to talk." That alone, those words, make something loosen in your chest. You tell him you've been feeling cautious, not cold, just complicated. He nods, doesn't push, just holds you. And for once, that's enough. No pressure, no expectation, just warmth. You don't have all the answers, but you know this. You're allowed to ask questions, even now, even here, in the middle of a marriage that's seen a dozen seasons and countless quiet nights. And tomorrow, when your daughter asks about her own body, her own choices, you'll look her in the eye and say, "You get to decide. Always." And for the first time, you'll mean it, for both of you. The bedroom is glowing with the soft blue light of a computer screen. It's the mid-1990s, and you've just learned how to send an email. You have a cordless phone, a minivan with a CD player, and a marriage that's in its second or third decade, depending on how you're counting. You still make dinner most nights, still fold laundry into neat little piles, still refill the same prescription every month. But now, there's something else quietly threading itself through your life. The internet. And with it, a sudden, chaotic flood of information about sex, relationships, pleasure, and what it all means in a marriage that's gone a little quiet. You're a wife in the age of dial-up and AOL chat rooms, and for the first time the silence of the marital bedroom is competing with a new kind of noise. Anonymous voices sharing secrets, advice columns answering questions you were too embarrassed to ask, and articles that don't just tell you how to please your husband but ask, "Are you even enjoying it yourself?" You're stunned and curious. You lean forward in your desk chair reading late into the night while your husband snores gently upstairs. Let's start with your historical fact. In the 1990s, access to sex education and conversations around female pleasure dramatically expanded thanks to the rise of the internet, cable television, and a surge of women's health books that made it to mainstream shelves. The Vagina Monologues was first performed in 1996, and suddenly people were talking, out loud, about sex, shame, and what women actually wanted. It was bold, messy, funny, and shocking. And for many married women like you, it opened a door you didn't even know existed. You start to wonder, is it too late to ask for more? To renegotiate what sex is in a marriage that's been running on autopilot for years? Because here's the thing, you're not unhappy. You love him. You've built a life together. But when it comes to sex, there's this deep well of unspoken things. He assumes you're satisfied, and you've let him. For years. Because it was easier. Because you weren't even sure what you needed. But now, reading these forums and articles, hearing women use words like climax and communication and resentment, you realise you've been swallowing your questions for decades, and there's something else. You've started to see that marriage doesn't automatically make sex safe or equal. You've read about women who've been married 20 years and still feel like sex is something that happens to them. You've seen others post about emotional disconnection, about husbands who don't understand that intimacy isn't just about access, it's about attention, about consent, even inside a marriage. Your fringe fact. In the mid-1990s, a few landmark court cases began to recognise marital rape as a crime in more states and countries. While still far from universal, the legal shift finally began chipping away at the centuries-old idea that marriage was a blanket form of consent. By 1993, all 50 US states had laws against marital rape, although enforcement and definitions varied wildly. The very fact that it had taken this long was a chilling reminder of how slow the world was to catch up with the idea that a wife's body belonged to herself. You sit with that knowledge late at night, staring at the glowing screen, trying to reconcile what you've lived with what you're learning. You think back on nights when you didn't say no, but didn't say yes either. When your body showed up, but your mind checked out. You wonder what might have been different if you'd been taught that sex was supposed to be mutual, not just in theory, but in practice. The open scholarly debate in this era centres around whether the internet is empowering women to reclaim their sexuality, or simply exposing them to new forms of pressure and comparison. After all, for every thoughtful forum post about pleasure and partnership, there's a pop-up ad promising 10 ways to drive him wild, or a glossy magazine headline about keeping your man satisfied. It's a double-edged sword. You want information, but you don't want another checklist that leaves you feeling like you're still failing. Tonight, your husband notices that you've been quiet. He asks, "You okay?" and you nod. But then, you pause. You don't want to keep nodding your way through a life half-lived. So you say gently, "Can we talk about us?" He looks surprised. Nervous, maybe. But he sits beside you on the bed and says, "Sure." You tell him you've been thinking about your sex life. Not complaining, not accusing, just thinking. That you've realised you don't always know how to ask for what you want. That sometimes you go along because it feels easier than explaining. That you'd like to try being more honest. He listens. He doesn't say much, but his eyes soften. "Okay," he says. "What do you want?" You exhale. You weren't sure he'd ask, so you start small. "I want to take our time more. I want to not rush. I want to talk about what I like, not just what you think I like." He nods. This is new territory for both of you. He reaches for your hand, not to pull you closer, but to hold it, to let you finish. That night sex is slower, different. Still clumsy in parts, still wrapped in years of habits and shortcuts, but you feel something shift. It's not fireworks, but it's real. It's yours. You're not just showing up, you're participating, choosing. Later, as he sleeps, you open your laptop one more time. You don't click on advice columns or forums, you just open a blank document and begin typing. You write, "I am allowed to want, I am allowed to ask," and you believe it. For the first time, maybe ever. You set your phone face down on the nightstand, the faint buzz of a text notification pulsing beneath it. It's 2007, and your husband is snoring softly beside you, one arm thrown across the pillow, still wearing his glasses. You pull the blanket up to your chin and stare at the ceiling, glowing faintly with the light of the digital alarm clock. You're in your 40s, or maybe 50s now, and marriage feels less like a romance and more like a company you both started and now co-run. Efficient, functional, dependable. But if you're honest, the passion has gone a bit stale. You're not angry, you're not sad, you're just flat. The kids are older, the house is quieter, and you've started wondering what's left of intimacy when it's no longer required, when no one's begging for it, when you can just say no, and he'll shrug and say okay and roll over without complaint. You're grateful for the respect. But something about the absence of expectation feels eerily close to neglect. Here's your historical fact. By the 2000s, studies consistently showed a drop in marital sex frequency, especially among long-term couples. Researchers started calling it the sexless marriage crisis, and therapists were flooded with clients, mostly women, wondering why they didn't want sex anymore, or why it had stopped feeling like connection, and started feeling like another chore they weren't quite meeting the quota for. What was once a silent struggle had become a national conversation, the kind that appeared on daytime talk shows and in op-eds with titles like, "Is marriage killing your sex drive?" You'd been watching, reading, clicking. You saw the headlines. You took the quizzes. How's your intimacy score? Are you emotionally available? Do you know your love language? There were apps now for tracking ovulation, for tracking moods, for scheduling date nights and timing orgasms. Technology had crept into every part of life, including the bedroom, and yet, somehow, sex still felt harder to talk about than ever. Your fringe fact. Around this time, the term maintenance sex started to show up in relationship blogs and advice columns. The idea was that couples, especially married ones, should have sex regularly, even when they don't feel like it, in order to keep the relationship stable. Some experts warned that sexless marriages were danger zones. Others insisted that forcing intimacy could do more harm than good. But there it was, the old guilt, dressed up in digital self-help language. Even now, you're still being told that if you don't give him sex, the whole relationship might fall apart. You start to notice how your own internal dialogue has changed. You're no longer trying to be sexy, you're trying to feel anything. You don't want pity or panic or plastic surgery commercials telling you to reignite the spark. You want touch that doesn't feel like a negotiation. You want your body to feel like a place you live in, not a tool, not a gift, not a withheld reward. So you schedule a doctor's appointment. Maybe it's hormones, maybe it's age. You sit in the sterile office, shifting uncomfortably on the crinkly paper, and explain that you just don't feel like it anymore. The doctor nods, offers you a pamphlet about estrogen therapy and a list of lubricants. But what you really want is someone to ask why. Why it feels like desire got up and left one day and never said goodbye. Why the idea of sex sometimes makes you feel tired, or even angry. But the doctor doesn't ask that. So you fold the pamphlet, thank her, and go home. That night your husband sits beside you on the couch watching a rerun of something forgettable. He looks over and says, "Are we okay?" You glance at him, startled. You didn't realise he'd noticed. You want to say yes. You want to say no. You say, "I don't know." He doesn't press. Just nods slowly, his fingers tightening slightly on the remote. The open scholarly debate in this era is whether women's declining interest in sex within marriage is biological, psychological, or social. Some point to hormonal shifts in midlife as the main culprit. Others argue it's emotional labour, carrying the invisible workload of motherhood, caregiving and household management, while also being expected to be spontaneously sexy on command. And still others say the real issue is that women were never taught that desire was theirs to keep. So when it dims, we don't know how to relight it, only how to blame ourselves for losing it. But tonight, something changes. Not a miracle, not a movie montage, just a question. You turn to your husband and ask, "When did we stop talking about sex?" He shrugs. "A long time ago, I think." You both stare ahead. Then, after a moment, he says, "Do you want to start again?" It's such a small sentence, almost nothing, but it hits like thunder. You don't jump into bed. You don't suddenly rip off your clothes and rediscover the lost art of foreplay. You just start with words. "Sometimes I feel invisible," you tell him. "Sometimes I think I've lost myself, and I don't know how to feel close to you unless I feel close to me first." He nods. He doesn't say, "I understand," because maybe he doesn't, but he says, "Okay," and in a way, that's enough. Later, as you lie in bed, not touching, not pretending, you think about how much effort it takes to be honest, how much trust it takes to say, "I'm not okay," how brave it feels to say, "I want again, but I need help getting there." You close your eyes, and for the first time in months you don't feel ashamed. You feel human, and that is its own kind of intimacy. The buzz of your smartphone cuts through the silence, a soft vibration against the nightstand glass. It's 2015, and you're lying in bed with one leg out from under the duvet, scrolling with one thumb while your husband dozes beside you. His face is dimly lit by the blue light of your screen, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, still snoring just faintly. You're married, you're stable, you're fine, and yet you're reading an article titled "What if you're married and don't want sex?" for the 4th time this month. Because here's the truth. Marriage, at this stage, feels like a quiet cohabitation agreement with shared groceries, a joint Netflix account, and one deeply worn-in mattress. You still care about him. You laugh at his jokes. You remember your anniversary. But sex, that's complicated, sporadic, sometimes awkward, often non-existent, not out of malice or dysfunction, just drift. Here's your historical fact. By the mid-2000s, researchers were reporting an increase in sexless marriages, defined, clinically, as fewer than 10 sexual encounters a year. Surveys showed that nearly 15% of married couples fell into this category, with many more hovering just above it. The interesting twist? Many women reported feeling relieved by the lack of pressure. They didn't miss the sex, they missed feeling wanted, feeling seen. The problem wasn't frequency, it was disconnection. You've probably Googled low sex drive in marriage more times than you can count. You've read blog posts by therapists. You've tried scheduling intimacy. You even bought a new bra that you now regret. Lace, scratchy, and about as sexy as a fire hazard. You're not broken, but you're tired of feeling like you're missing something. You've started to suspect that the problem isn't your body, it's the script. You were raised to believe that good marriages have sex, that a healthy woman desires her husband, that if you're not having sex, someone's at fault, usually you. But what if you don't want it in the way you used to? What if desire looks different now, slower, quieter, more about connection than climax? Here's your fringe fact. In 2014, a viral essay titled "Marriage Without Sex" swept across relationship forums, sparking thousands of comments from women who said, "Me too." Some were young, some old, some in new marriages, others in decades-deep unions. But all of them were saying the same thing. "I love my partner, but I don't feel that kind of want anymore, and I don't know what to do about it." Some tried therapy, others opened their marriages. A few quietly stayed, hoping the phase would pass, but many began asking harder questions. Not just how do I fix this, but do I need to? And who told me I was supposed to want sex this often anyway? The open scholarly debate now is whether low desire in long-term marriages is a problem to be solved, or a natural evolution of love. Some psychologists argue that passion fades for everyone eventually, and that expecting marriage to remain sexually charged forever is unrealistic. Others insist that intimacy is a muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it. Then there are the radical voices, mostly feminist, often queer, who say maybe the goal shouldn't be more sex, but more honesty. Maybe your marriage doesn't need fixing. Maybe it just needs redefinition. You turn off your phone and lie back, thinking about how different your view of sex is now. You used to think of it as something owed, something counted, a marker of worth, of normalcy. Now you're not sure what it is anymore, but you know you want to feel close to him, just maybe not in the way the world tells you is correct. So the next morning over coffee you say it. "I miss feeling close to you," you admit, "but I don't always want sex. I don't know what that means." He stirs his mug, looks at you for a long time, then says, "Okay, so let's figure out what closeness looks like now." And that, his willingness not to fix but to ask, feels more intimate than any lingerie catalogue version of seduction. You start small. You hold hands in the grocery store again. You send each other dumb memes. You watch movies on the couch without phones in your hands. One night, you lie next to each other, faces inches apart, and just talk. Not about bills or kids or work, about yourselves, about what it means to still be discovering each other after all these years. And then slowly a different kind of intimacy returns. Not the scripted kind, not performative, but genuine. You touch without expectation. You kiss without countdown. You let your body rest in his, not out of duty, not even out of desire, but out of trust. Later you lie with his arm around you, and you don't feel pressure or failure. You feel warm, whole, unrushed. You realise that you haven't been broken. You've just been unspoken. And now, finally, you're learning the new language of your marriage, one word at a time. The bedroom is quiet except for the soft clicking of the air purifier and the occasional chirp of your smartwatch reminding you to breathe. It's 2023, and you're lying on your side of the bed, knees drawn up slightly, blanket tucked under your chin. Your husband is next to you, reading something on his tablet. The light from the screen reflects in the lenses of his glasses, and for a moment, you just watch him. The way his brow furrows slightly when he concentrates, the way his foot still twitches sometimes when he's relaxed. After all these years, you know his rhythms like your own. And still, sometimes, he feels like a mystery. You're still married, still showing up, still working through what it means to share a life, a home, and a body. But now, finally, you're starting to realise that married sex, for women especially, has always been something more layered than anyone ever warned you about. It's not just a question of yes or no. It's about power and safety and visibility. It's about unlearning and relearning. It's about letting yourself feel again in a world that taught you to be quiet. Here's your historical fact. By the early 2020s, mainstream conversations around sex and marriage became more nuanced and widely accepted. Podcasts, social media, and an explosion of couples therapy influencers brought previously private issues into the light. Things like emotional labour, mismatched libido, sexual trauma, and the myth of wifely duty. More women began openly discussing their dissatisfaction, not as personal failure, but as evidence of long overdue cultural reckoning. The very idea that marriage guaranteed sex, finally being interrogated. You've watched this unfold, quietly at first, then with growing interest. You found yourself nodding through TikToks about emotional load, bookmarking Instagram posts that said things like, "Consent doesn't expire with a wedding ring." You heard younger women talk about what they expect from marriage, partnership, pleasure, patience, and felt a pang of longing. Not because you missed being young, but because you wish someone had told you it was okay to ask for those things too. The fringe fact. In 2022, a widely shared article in a major women's magazine made headlines for arguing that maintenance sex was outdated and rooted in misogyny. It questioned the entire concept of performing sex to keep a man interested, arguing instead that intimacy should be cultivated, not scheduled. The backlash, of course, was fierce. Some readers accused it of undermining marriage itself. Others called it liberating. But you? You read it twice, and for the first time, you felt seen. The open scholarly debate now circles around whether the push for sexual autonomy and emotional transparency is making marriages stronger, or straining them beyond repair. Some studies suggest that couples who discuss their sexual needs more openly report higher satisfaction, even if frequency declines. Others worry that the pressure to be perfectly communicative about everything creates a new kind of exhaustion. But you don't need a journal article to tell you what you already feel, that the moment you stopped pretending was the moment your marriage actually started evolving. Tonight you reach over and gently place your hand on your husband's arm. He looks over his tablet, surprised but smiling. You ask, "Can we talk for a minute?" He nods and puts it down. "I've been thinking about us," you begin, "about how things have changed, about what I want now." He listens, not interrupting, just breathing slowly. You tell him that your relationship has been full of love, but that love hasn't always meant understanding. That sex, for so long, was something you gave, not something you truly shared. That you want to reclaim it, not for performance, not for obligation, but for joy, for curiosity, for the version of yourself that you're finally starting to trust. He doesn't flinch, he just says, "Tell me more." So you do. You talk about what you've learnt in therapy, about your changing body, about how you've started to feel again, not just physically, but emotionally. You explain how so much of your past sexual experience was shaped by silence, shame, and submission, that for years you thought pleasure was something you had to earn. And then you say, "I don't want to keep surviving my sex life. I want to live it." He takes your hand, not as a lead-in to something more, just to hold it. The next day you buy new sheets, not silky ones, not red, just soft and comfortable, ones that feel like home. You light a candle before bed, not to set a mood, but because it makes you feel good. You stop measuring intimacy and frequency, and start measuring it in tenderness. A quiet brush of the hand, a conversation that leaves you feeling heard, a kiss that doesn't ask for anything. You and your husband begin to explore, not acrobatics or grand reinventions, just honesty. Some nights that means long, open conversations. Other nights it means touching each other gently, without pressure to perform. And sometimes you laugh halfway through, or cry, or pause, and it's okay. You've learned that a married woman's sex life is not a timeline of performance milestones. It's a landscape, sometimes fertile, sometimes dormant, but always yours to walk. No one else gets to map it for you. One night, weeks later, you find yourself reaching for him, not from habit or guilt or loneliness, just because you want to. He smiles, surprised, but he doesn't ask why, and you don't explain. You just let it happen, slowly, curiously, gently. When it's over, you lie with your head on his chest and realize you didn't just want the act. You wanted the moment, the connection, the agency, and you claimed it. Your body, after all these years, is finally something you inhabit, not something you perform in, not something you surrender, but something that's yours. You close your eyes and exhale. It took a lifetime, but you made it. So here you are. Lights dim, blanket tugged up just right, the hum of the fan spinning low above your head. You've journeyed through centuries of married life, through corsets and courtship, through whispered duty and slow rebellion, through lace-trimmed silence and late-night awakenings, and now, finally, you're lying still but no longer quiet. You know something now that you maybe didn't before, that married sex for women has never just been about sex. It's been about survival, identity, power, connection, autonomy. It's been both sanctuary and battlefield. And it's been shaped by laws, by culture, by medicine, by fear, and only recently by choice. You think back on the versions of yourself, the young bride who didn't know she was allowed to ask, the mother who said yes through clenched teeth, the middle-aged woman who thought she'd lost desire for good. But now you see them all with tenderness, because they brought you here, to this moment, to this body that's still yours, still breathing, still learning what it means to be touched on your own terms. You won't get it perfect every time, that's not the point. The point is that you're no longer waiting to be given permission. You're writing your own script now. So as you sink deeper into the quiet, just remember, you're allowed to ask questions. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to want, or not want, to rest, to pause, to begin again. And if you're lying beside someone you love, maybe tonight's the night to roll over. Not to perform, not to fix, but just to say, hey, can we talk? Or maybe not. Either way, you've earned your peace. Close your eyes, let it all go. You're safe now. You're home.